For 11 years of marriage, my husband and I desperately tried to build a family, but faced only heartbreak and empty nurseries. Then, in front of a crowded ballroom, my husband proudly announced that my younger sister was carrying his twins. I did not scream or cry. I quietly signed the divorce papers he threw at me and walked away. When he went home to celebrate his new life, his mother went completely pale and asked him one simple question. "Wait, she did not tell you." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated you. My name is Fiona, and I am 34 years old. As a financial auditor and a private silent investor, I spent my entire adult life building a quiet but massive empire. But to my family, I was nothing more than a walking, automated teller machine and a perpetual disappointment. That painful reality was never more obvious than on a crisp Sunday afternoon at the Oakbrook Country Club. The grand ballroom was draped in expensive pastel floral arrangements, custom silk tablecloths, and towering displays of imported pastries. I had personally footed the $15,000 bill for this lavish baby shower. It was for my younger sister, Brittany. Brittany was 30 years old and the undeniable golden child of our family. She sat in the center of the room on a literal velvet throne glowing with the attention of 60 guests. She was expecting twins. For me, attending this shower was an exercise in pure emotional torture. For 11 years, my husband Derek and I had tried to conceive. We endured the sterile clinic waiting rooms, the invasive medical tests, and the crushing disappointment month after month. Derek had always played the part of the supportive and mourning husband perfectly. He would hold my hand, tell me that it was okay, and reassure me that our love was enough. I believed his lies completely. As I stood near the back of the ballroom, sipping sparkling water and making sure the catering staff kept the buffet replenished, Derek tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter of the room. Everyone turned their attention to the center stage where Derek stood. He looked incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, flashing that charismatic smile that had won me over all those years ago. I smiled warmly, assuming he was going to give a polite speech thanking the guests and congratulating his sister-in-law. But he did not look at me. He looked directly at Brittany. Derek walked over to her velvet throne. The room fell into a hush of anticipation. He reached out, took Brittany by the hand, and gently pulled her up to stand beside him. Then, right there in front of my parents, our extended family, and my closest friends, Derek leaned in and kissed my sister. It was not a polite, familial peck on the cheek. It was a deep, passionate kiss that sent a shockwave of audible gasps rippling across the grand ballroom. My brain simply stopped processing information. I felt the air leave my lungs. I stood frozen by the dessert table, staring at the man I had loved for over a decade. Derek pulled away from Brittany, wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, and lifted the microphone back to his mouth. His eyes finally found mine across the sea of stunned faces. He did not look guilty. He looked triumphant. "After 11 years of waiting, I am finally going to be a father," Derek announced, his voice booming through the speakers and echoing off the high ceilings. "Brittany is giving me the family Fiona never could." The silence that followed was suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I could hear the faint sound of a fork dropping onto a plate somewhere in the back of the room. My vision tunneled directly onto Derek and Brittany. My sister was blushing, looking down at her designer shoes, with a coy smile, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just publicly destroyed my life. Derek dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a loud thud. He walked down the small steps of the stage, parting the crowd of paralyzed guests, and marched straight toward me. He stopped right in front of the gift table beside me. From the inside pocket of his suit jacket, he pulled out a thick manila folder and slammed it down onto the table. "Sign the divorce papers, Fiona," Derek said, his voice loud enough for the first few rows of guests to hear clearly. "I am moving Brittany into the master suite tomorrow. Do not make a scene. Do not act crazy. You know you can never give me what I need. It is time for you to step aside and let a real woman take care of me. I stared at the folder. The word divorce was printed neatly on the tab. My hands were trembling slightly, but a sudden icy calm began to spread through my veins. Before I could even formulate a single word, my mother Linda shoved her way through the crowd. I expected her to slap Derek. I expected her to scream at Brittany for betraying her own sister. Instead, my mother flanked Brittany, protectively glaring at me with absolute venom. "Do not you dare ruin your sister's miracle with your frigid attitude. Fiona," my mother snapped, her voice shrill and full of resentment. "You have always been a selfish workaholic. You care more about your boring accounting spreadsheets than you ever cared about giving this man a family. Just like when you selfishly refused to pay off Brittany's credit card debt in college, you are trying to ruin her happiness now. Pack your bags tonight and get out of Derek's house. Brittany needs a stress-free environment for the babies." The sheer audacity of her words washed over me. This was my mother, the woman who had spent my entire life enabling Brittany's disastrous decisions. 10 years ago, Brittany had racked up $40,000 in debt on luxury vacations and designer clothes. My parents had begged me to drain my hard-earned savings to rescue her. When I refused, I became the villain. I became the selfish daughter. Now they were officially discarding me so the golden child could claim my husband and my life. I looked at Derek standing tall and arrogant. I looked at Brittany hiding behind my mother's protective embrace. I looked at the folder sitting on the table. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees and beg for an explanation. The profound grief that should have shattered me was instantly replaced by a cold, calculated clarity. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my favorite fountain pen. I opened the manila folder, flipped past the pages of legal demands, and found the signature line on the final page. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a perfectly steady hand. "Congratulations, Derek," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table toward him. "You and my sister deserve exactly what you are about to get." Derek smirked, clearly disappointed that I had not given him the hysterical sobbing reaction he wanted. He picked up the folder, puffing out his chest. "Good. Now go grab a taxi. We have a party to finish." I turned away from him, completely ignoring his command. I looked past the crowd of staring guests and locked eyes with the country club general manager, who was standing near the entrance, looking absolutely horrified by the family drama unfolding in his venue. I walked directly over to him, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The crowd parted for me instinctively. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrison," I said, maintaining my polite, professional demeanor. "I need to close out my tab immediately." The manager blinked, stammering slightly. "Of course, ma'am. Right away." The current balance for the catering, the venue rental, and the floral arrangements has reached $3,000. The open bar has accumulated an additional $12,000. "Cancel my card on file," I instructed him, clearly, ensuring my voice carried back to where my family was standing. "I am paying for exactly nothing." From this second forward, the groom and the grandmother of the babies are fully responsible for the $15,000 balance. You can collect the payment from Linda or Derek. If they refuse to pay, feel free to call the police for theft of services. My mother's jaw dropped open. "What? Fiona, you cannot do that? You promised to pay for this shower." "I promised to pay for my sister's baby shower," I replied, turning back to look at her shocked face. "I did not promise to fund my husband's paternity reveal with his mistress. Have a lovely afternoon, Mother. Enjoy the bill." Derek's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. He took a step forward, his face turning red with sudden panic. "Fiona, wait. You cannot just leave us with a $15,000 tab. You know all my money is tied up in the business right now." I looked him up and down with absolute disgust. "That sounds like a personal problem, Derek. Maybe Brittany can chip in. Oh wait, she does not have a job. Good luck." Without waiting for another word, I turned on my heel and walked out of the grand ballroom. Behind me, the chaotic sounds of my mother screaming at the manager and Derek, cursing loudly, echoed through the hallway. The heavy wooden doors of the club closed, shutting out the noise and leaving me in the quiet, cool air of the lobby. I walked out to the valet, handed the attendant my ticket, and pulled my phone from my purse. My hands were finally starting to shake, the adrenaline wearing off, to reveal the gaping wound in my chest. 11 years of my life had just been erased in a matter of seconds. But I was not a weak, helpless woman. I was a financial auditor who specialized in uncovering hidden truths, and I had spent the last decade building a silent empire that Derek knew absolutely nothing about. I opened my messages and selected the contact for my lead corporate attorney. I typed out a single definitive sentence: "Execute Protocol Alpha. Burn it all down." I hit send, slipped the phone back into my bag, and stepped into my waiting car. The war had just begun, and they had no idea they were entirely unarmed. The drive from the country club to my estate took exactly 22 minutes. I spent that entire time staring at the road ahead, feeling the erratic rhythm of my heart gradually settle into a slow, deliberate beat. The initial shock of my husband announcing his infidelity on a stage in front of 60 people had completely evaporated. In its place was a profound, chilling sense of purpose. I turned onto my private street, where the towering oak trees cast long shadows across the pavement. My house was a custom-built, architectural masterpiece of glass, steel, and dark wood, sitting on 2 acres of meticulously landscaped property. It was the physical manifestation of my life work. As my car rounded the final bend, my foot pressed hard against the brake pedal. A massive commercial moving truck was parked illegally across my pristine driveway, crushing a row of imported hydrangeas I had planted just last month. The heavy metal ramp was fully extended, and the back of the truck was wide open. My father Richard was standing near the base of the ramp, sweating through his expensive golf shirt. He was hoisting a large cardboard box labeled "Nursery Decor" in bright pink marker. A few feet away, my sister Brittany was directing a pair of hired movers, pointing a manicured finger toward my custom mahogany front door. She was already treating the property like it belonged to her, complaining loudly about how the entryway lighting would need to be completely overhauled to suit her tastes. I put my car in park, stepped out, and slammed the door shut. The sharp crack of the car door echoed across the driveway, instantly drawing their attention. Brittany froze mid-sentence, her hand dropping to her side. She quickly stepped behind my father, using him as a physical shield. Richard dropped the heavy box onto the driveway and wiped his brow. He did not look guilty or ashamed. He looked entirely annoyed by my presence. He marched directly toward me, stopping right at the edge of the front steps to physically block my path to the front door. "What are you doing here, Fiona?" My father demanded, his voice loud and dripping with condescension. "Derek specifically told you to pack your bags quietly. You were supposed to be gone by the time we arrived. Hand over your house keys right now, and do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." I stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the man who had spent my entire life treating me like a second-class citizen in my own family. "You are currently trespassing on my property," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Tell those movers to put my sister's cheap plastic garbage back into that truck immediately." Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made the veins in his neck bulge. "Your property. Do not be ridiculous. Derek is the man of the house, and he has made his decision. Brittany needs the space for the twins. This is a 5-bedroom estate with a massive backyard. What exactly are you going to do with all this square footage? Sit around in empty rooms and cry over your barrenness? You are a single woman now, Fiona. You can easily afford a small, cramped apartment somewhere downtown with your boring little accounting spreadsheets. Leave this home to a real family." The sheer audacity of his words did not break me. It only fueled the fire burning behind my ribs. My father had always viewed my career as a tedious little hobby. He never understood the magnitude of my work, and he certainly never respected it. "You mean the same boring spreadsheets that paid for your mortgage when your construction business nearly went bankrupt 5 years ago?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You seem to forget who always foots the bill in this family. You want to talk about what people need. 10 years ago, I needed my college savings to finish my degree. But you and Mom forced me to drain every single penny of my accounts to pay off Brittany's massive credit card debt because she maxed out 5 different cards buying designer clothes she could not afford." You told me that family sacrifices for each other. You told me Brittany was fragile and needed a clean slate. Richard crossed his arms, his face turning a dark shade of red. That was entirely different. Brittany made a few youthful mistakes, and we handled it as a family. You were always too focused on yourself and your money. You never understood the meaning of unconditional love. And look where your selfishness got you. Your husband had to look to your own sister to find a woman willing to give him children. Just hand over the keys, Fiona. A slow, arrogant clapping sound echoed from the front porch. I looked past my father to see Derek stepping out of my front door. He was holding a glass of my most expensive imported scotch, leaning against the stone pillar with a sickeningly triumphant smile plastered across his face. He walked down the steps, coming to stand right beside my father, presenting a united front against me. "Listen to your father, Fiona," Derek sneered, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You have lost. There is no point in dragging this out and embarrassing yourself further. My tech startup is generating record profits this quarter. We are securing millions in venture capital as we speak. I am going to be generous because I pity you. If you walk away right now and leave the house exactly as it is, I will set up a nice little pity alimony payment for you. A few thousand a month to keep you quiet and comfortable in whatever tiny apartment you manage to find. You can take your clothes and your boring accounting books, but the furniture, the electronics, and the house stay with me and Brittany." I looked at Derek, absorbing his complete delusion. He actually believed he was the one in control. He truly thought he was a titan of industry, graciously tossing crumbs to the woman he had just publicly humiliated. Brittany finally gathered the courage to step out from behind my father. She rested her hands on her slightly rounded stomach, a gesture clearly designed to twist the knife. "Derek is being more than fair to you, Fiona," she said, her voice adopting that fake sweet tone she always used when she wanted to play the victim. "We are going to turn your home office into the nursery. The natural light in there is just perfect for the babies. Please do not be toxic about this. We just want to be happy." I let her words hang in the heavy afternoon air. The three of them stood on my driveway, completely convinced they had orchestrated the perfect coup. They thought I was going to break down weeping and hand over the keys to the kingdom I had built with my own two hands. I slowly unclasped my designer handbag. I reached inside my fingers, brushing past my wallet and my car keys, until I found the thick, crisp envelope I had prepared months ago for an entirely different emergency. I pulled the envelope out and tapped it against my palm. "You know, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm volume, "you have always loved playing the role of the brilliant, successful tech founder. You love the sound of your own voice in a boardroom, but you have always possessed a fatal flaw. You absolutely despise reading contracts before you sign them." Derek frowned, his confident posture faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about? Stop stalling and give Richard the keys." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not hand over my keys. I extended my arm and pressed the thick envelope firmly against Derek's chest. He instinctively grabbed it, looking down at the heavy legal seal stamped on the front. "That is a formal notice of immediate eviction," I announced loudly, ensuring the hired movers lingering near the truck could hear every single word. "You have exactly 1 hour to remove yourself and your pregnant mistress from my property before I have you arrested for criminal trespassing." Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You cannot evict a man from his own home, Fiona. This is marital property. A judge will laugh you out of the courtroom." I turned my gaze to my father, offering him a smile that felt like absolute ice. "It is not marital property. This estate was never purchased in Derek's name. It was never purchased in my name either. 4 years ago, when this house was built, it was purchased entirely in cash by a private limited liability company. That company is owned completely and exclusively by a blind trust. A trust that I established 10 years ago before Derek and I were even married." I watched the color begin to drain from Derek's face. He looked down at the eviction notice in his hands, his eyes frantically scanning the legal jargon printed on the first page. "I am the sole beneficiary of that trust," I continued, my voice ringing out clearly across the driveway. "Derek's name is not on the deed. It is not on the property tax records. It is nowhere on any financial document tied to this estate. He is legally classified as a month-to-month tenant, and I am formally terminating his tenancy effective immediately." Brittany gasped, taking a step backward. She looked at Derek, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "Derek, tell me she is lying. Tell me this is your house. You promised me this house." Derek swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. He crumpled the eviction notice in his fist, his arrogant facade rapidly dissolving into sheer panicked rage. He glared at me, his chest heaving as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had assumed that because we were married, half of everything belonged to him. He never bothered to ask questions about how the mortgage was paid because there was never a mortgage to begin with. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Derek spat, taking a threatening step toward me. "You think a clever little real estate trick is going to save you? You are nothing but a glorified human calculator." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, furiously tapping on the screen. His fingers were actually shaking as he unlocked his banking application. "Fine," he snarled, his eyes locked on his screen. "You want to play hardball over a house? Keep the damn house. I do not care. I am the chief executive officer of a rapidly expanding tech firm. I am freezing our joint bank accounts right now. I am cutting off your credit cards. I am stripping your access to every single cent of my company's profits. By tomorrow morning, you will not even be able to buy a cup of coffee without begging me for permission." Derek pressed his thumb against the screen to execute his threat, waiting for the satisfying confirmation that he had ruined me financially. I stood completely still, watching his face. I waited for the exact moment his eyes registered the numbers on his screen. I watched his jaw drop open, his arrogant snarl vanishing into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Derek frantically tapped the glass screen of his phone. The confident, arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago vanished completely. It was replaced by a sickly pale expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He closed his mobile banking application and reopened it rapidly, staring at the landing page as if the digital numbers were written in a foreign language. He swiped his thumb down to refresh the screen once, twice, 3 times. The result remained absolutely identical. Every single joint account we shared, checking, savings, money market, and the emergency reserve displayed a glaring balance of exactly $0.00. Brittany leaned over his arm, trying to get a look at the screen. "Derek, what is it?" she whined, her voice pitching upward in irritation. "Freeze her card so we can get inside the house. My feet are swelling and I need to sit down." Derek ignored her completely. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, wild energy. "Where is it?" he demanded. His voice was a harsh, breathless whisper that betrayed his rising panic. "Where is the money, Fiona? The primary account is empty. The savings are gone." "Where did you move my money?" I adjusted the strap of my designer bag on my shoulder, completely unbothered by his sudden distress. "It was never your money, Derek," I stated plainly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It was our money, and as the primary breadwinner of this marriage, it was mostly my money. And now it is safely secured where you cannot touch a single dime." Derek took a threatening step forward, but my father threw an arm out to stop him. "You cannot just steal money from your husband, Fiona," my father barked, pointing a thick, heavy finger directly at my face. "That is illegal. That is marital theft. You are going to end up in a jail cell if you do not reverse those transfers immediately." I let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed across the manicured driveway. It is absolutely fascinating how quickly you all become legal scholars when your own greed is on the line. But you are entirely wrong, Richard. It is not theft if it is executed through a court-approved financial separation. Derek froze, his phone slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. "A what?" he stammered. "A legal financial separation." I repeated, enunciating every single syllable so there could be no misunderstanding. "I filed the official paperwork exactly 3 months ago. The judge granted it, quietly binding our assets pending a final divorce decree. You would have known all about it if you ever bothered to open the legal mail at your corporate office instead of having your assistant forward everything straight to the shredder." I watched the brutal reality sink into his brain. For 3 solid months, I had been meticulously and legally untangling my entire financial life from his. 3 months ago, I had noticed glaring irregularities in his corporate expense reports. There were massive charges for luxury hotel suites, imported jewelry, and high-end restaurants that never correlated with his actual business trips. I knew he was hiding something terrible. I just did not know he was hiding my own sister. But I did not need to know the exact nature of his betrayal to know I needed to protect my assets from his reckless spending. While you were busy playing house with Brittany behind my back, I was busy legally transferring every single cent of my personal wealth and my legal half of the joint funds into private offshore accounts, I explained smoothly. Those accounts are untouchable, Derek. They are shielded by layers of international corporate law and managed by a blind trustee who answers only to me. You cannot freeze my cards. You cannot access my cash. You cannot take a single penny to fund your new life with your mistress. My mother, Linda, pushed past my father, her face contorted with absolute fury. She marched up to me, stopping just inches from my face. Her eyes were blazing with the kind of toxic entitlement she had nurtured her entire life. "You are a thief!" she screamed, her shrill voice echoing down the quiet, affluent street. "You are a cold, calculating thief. You are hoarding millions of dollars while your own sister is standing right here carrying twins." I looked at my mother, refusing to blink or back down an inch. Brittany is carrying her sister's husband's babies. Let us be very clear about the terminology here, Linda. She made her choices, and now she gets to live with the financial consequences. Family shares everything. Fiona, my mother, continued completely ignoring my point and waving her hands frantically. Family takes care of each other no matter what. Brittany is bringing new life into this world. She needs that money for the maternity fund. She needs the security to raise those children properly. You will transfer those funds back into the joint account right this instant, or I swear I will testify against you in court. I will tell the judge you are mentally unstable and vindictive. I could not help the genuine smile that spread across my face. It was incredibly amusing to watch them scramble like rats on a sinking ship. You are demanding that I fund my cheating husband and my backstabbing sister so they can buy designer baby clothes with my hard-earned money. I asked, my tone reflecting pure disbelief. You really have lost your mind, Linda. You spent my entire childhood telling me I was a selfish disappointment. Now you are demanding I subsidize your golden child's ultimate betrayal. Not a single cent of my money will ever touch Brittany's hands. You can fund her maternity leave yourself. Brittany began to cry, real tears this time, clutching Derek's arm desperately. "Derek, you promised me," she sobbed, burying her face against his shoulder. "You promised me the custom nursery in this house. You promised me the new luxury SUV for the babies. You said she would just go away quietly and we would have everything. You told me we were rich." Hearing Brittany whine seemed to snap Derek out of his panicked stupor. He shook off his initial shock and straightened his posture, puffing out his chest to regain his perceived dominance. He shoved his phone deep into his pocket and glared at me with renewed blinding arrogance. He needed to prove to Brittany and my parents that he was still the alpha in the room. "You think you are so incredibly clever," Fiona, Derek sneered, taking a slow, measured step toward me. "You think moving some cash offshore makes you untouchable. You are forgetting exactly who you are dealing with. I am the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar tech firm. I am the founder. I am the visionary. I do not need your little savings accounts to survive." He pointed a finger directly at my face, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "I have access to massive corporate funds. I have a board of directors backing my every single move. If you want to play dirty, we will absolutely play dirty. I am going to use my corporate accounts to hire the most ruthless, bloodthirsty legal team in this entire city. I will drag you through years of agonizing litigation. I will tie up those offshore accounts in so much legal red tape, you will be completely bankrupt just paying your own lawyer fees. I will utterly destroy you in court, Fiona. By the time my lawyers are done with you, you will be begging me for that tiny apartment I offered you." I stood on the driveway listening to the man who thought he ruled the world. He was so blindingly arrogant, so completely blinded by his own inflated ego and corporate titles. He truly believed he held all the cards. He believed his title gave him absolute unyielding power over me. He thought he could crush me with the snap of his fingers. I looked at my father, who was nodding firmly in agreement with Derek's threats. I looked at my mother, who was gently stroking Brittany's hair and whispering reassurances that Derek would handle everything. Then I looked back at Derek, locking eyes with the man who was about to lose absolutely everything he thought he owned. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my legal strategy. I simply smiled. It was a slow, genuine, peaceful smile that caused Derek's confident glare to falter for a brief fraction of a second. The complete lack of fear in my eyes unnerved him, but his ego would not allow him to show it. I adjusted my designer bag on my shoulder, turned around, and walked gracefully toward my waiting car. I opened the driver's side door, sliding into the luxurious leather seat. I rolled down the window just as Derek stepped forward, clearly agitated by my absolute silence and refusal to cower. "Good luck with that ruthless legal team, Derek," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the warm afternoon air. I started the engine, the powerful motor purring instantly to life. "Make sure you wear your absolute best suit. I will see you at the office on Monday morning." Monday morning arrived with a torrential coastal downpour, but Derek strode into the glass and steel lobby of Vertex Solutions completely untouched by the rain. He wore a brand new bespoke navy suit specifically chosen to project absolute authority and wealth. He walked with the swagger of a man who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. He stopped by the front reception desk, slapping his platinum executive keycard onto the polished marble counter. He did not bother to greet the receptionist. Instead, he loudly demanded that she get the chief financial officer on the line immediately. He barked instructions for her to draft an emergency corporate draw authorization for exactly $500,000. He made sure to speak loud enough for the interns and junior developers waiting in the lobby to hear every single word. He boasted that he needed the funds to secure a luxury penthouse condo in the financial district by noon because his beautiful growing family required a corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows. Derek grabbed a black coffee from the executive break room and marched down the carpeted corridor toward the main boardroom. It was time for the weekly executive leadership meeting. He intended to walk and demand his emergency funds and recount the story of how he had finally shed his deadweight wife over the weekend. He reached the heavy frosted glass double doors of the boardroom. He did not knock. He never knocked. He kicked the right door open with his polished leather shoe, expecting his entire executive team to immediately stand at attention and greet their visionary leader. He opened his mouth to bark his first morning command, but the words died instantly in his throat. His expensive coffee cup tilted dangerously in his hand, spilling dark hot liquid onto his pristine white cuffs. At the far end of the sprawling 20-foot mahogany table sat Fiona. She was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate knot. She occupied the high-backed leather chair that Derek exclusively reserved for himself. Flanking her on either side were 4 men and 2 women in immaculate dark suits. These were not the company's standard in-house counsel. Derek recognized their faces from industry magazines. These were elite, high-powered corporate litigators from the most feared and expensive law firm in the city. The regular board members and executive vice presidents were seated rigidly along the sides of the long table. Their faces were pale, their hands folded neatly in front of them, and they were completely, utterly silent. Derek blinked rapidly, his brain violently struggling to process the impossible image before him. He slammed his coffee cup onto the nearest credenza, splashing brown stains against the wall. He pointed a trembling finger at Fiona, his face twisting into a mask of pure outrage. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with raw panic and fury. "This is a secure corporate facility. You cannot just walk in here because you are angry about a divorce." He spun around and glared at the vice president of operations. "Call security right now. Have this insane soon-to-be ex-wife physically removed from my building immediately. She is having a mental breakdown and bringing our petty domestic disputes into my corporate boardroom." Nobody moved. The vice president of operations stared down at his yellow legal pad, refusing to meet Derek's eyes. The chief financial officer cleared his throat nervously and looked toward the ceiling. The heavy wooden door behind Derek suddenly opened, and two large uniformed security guards stepped into the room. Derek smirked victoriously, his chest puffing out again. Finally, he snapped, snapping his fingers at the guards. "Grab her by the arms and throw her out onto the street. If she resists, call the police and press charges for trespassing." The security guards did not walk toward Fiona. They stepped fully inside the room, closed the frosted glass doors, and stood silently against the back wall, flanking the exit. They folded their arms behind their backs. They were deliberately blocking Derek from leaving the room. Fiona steepled her fingers, resting her elbows on the polished mahogany table. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her absolute calm commanded the entire room. "Derek," she began, her tone chillingly smooth. "You really should have read the foundational operating agreements you signed 5 years ago. You love parading around this city calling yourself a visionary founder and a brilliant chief executive. You love telling the media how you pulled this company out of the ashes through your own sheer willpower and unmatched genius." Fiona reached beside her chair and picked up a massive stack of heavily bound legal documents. She placed her hand flat on top of the thick binder and shoved it hard. The heavy portfolio glided rapidly across the smooth, polished wood of the long table and stopped directly at Derek's fingertips. Derek stared at it as if it were a live explosive. "5 years ago, your precious startup was hemorrhaging cash," Fiona explained, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "You were exactly 12 hours away from declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You were drowning in corporate debt, your servers were about to be repossessed by your creditors, and you were going to lose absolutely everything. Then miraculously, a nameless angel investor operating through a private holding firm swooped in and bought out your entire massive debt portfolio. You bragged to me that night over dinner about how your undeniable genius had finally been recognized by Wall Street elites." Derek stared at her, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked down at the heavy binder but refused to touch it. "You did not even bother to read the acquisition terms," Fiona continued relentlessly, her eyes locking onto his terrified face. "You were just so desperate to save your fragile ego and keep your fancy office that you signed wherever the proxy lawyers told you to sign. You never questioned who was saving you. That silent holding firm is called Sterling Vanguard, and I am the sole owner and chief executive of Sterling Vanguard. I bought your debt, Derek. I acquired 100% of your intellectual property. I own the software patents. I own the proprietary code. I own the physical servers. I even own the commercial lease to this very building. You do not own a single share of this company." Derek gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. "No," he gasped, shaking his head frantically side to side. "No, that is mathematically impossible. I am the founder. I am the chief executive officer. I built this entire company from the ground up." "You built absolutely nothing," Fiona corrected sharply, her voice cracking through the room like a whip. "You have only ever been a salaried W-2 employee. You are a figurehead, a glorified corporate mascot I kept around because it amused me and because it kept you out of my way while I managed the real financial investments. You work for me, Derek. And as your majority shareholder and your direct employer, I am officially terminating your employment contract effective immediately for gross corporate misconduct." Derek looked around the boardroom, his eyes wide and frantic like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had just slammed shut. He looked desperately at his chief financial officer, his lead software developer, his senior vice presidents. He expected them to jump to his defense, to declare a walkout, to stand by their visionary leader. Instead, they were all looking at him with a mixture of sheer pity and profound disgust. They had all known the truth. They had all seen the real organizational charts. He had been strutting around as their boss for years, when in reality he was just another middle management employee dancing on a string that Fiona completely controlled. He opened his mouth to scream, to demand they walk out with him, in protest, to threaten them all with total professional ruin. But before Derek could utter a single desperate word, Fiona pressed a small black remote control resting in her palm. The heavy motorized blackout blinds on the boardroom windows silently lowered, plunging the large room into shadows. She pressed a second button, and the large high-definition overhead projector hummed instantly to life. A massive, meticulously organized spreadsheet illuminated the stark white wall behind her. The screen displayed hundreds of highlighted corporate bank transactions, deep financial audit logs, and cross-referenced credit card receipts. Derek, you should really pay close attention to the screen right now, Fiona said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper that sent a visible shiver down his spine. Because I am not just terminating your employment today. I spent my entire weekend heavily auditing your corporate expense accounts. And because of the massive illegal discrepancies displayed right behind me, I am pressing federal embezzlement charges. The spreadsheet illuminated the room with a harsh white glow. I pressed the button on my remote and the screen transitioned to a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the official company ledger. On the right were screenshots from Brittany's public social media accounts. I pointed the red laser pointer at a transaction from exactly 2 months ago. You categorized a $45,000 wire transfer as a vendor payment for outsourced server maintenance, I stated, my voice echoing off the frosted glass walls. But the routing number belongs to a luxury auto dealership. That exact same afternoon, my sister posted a picture of herself leaning against a brand new Range Rover with a giant red bow on the hood. The caption thanked her amazing provider for his generosity. Derek wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but I clicked to the next slide before he could formulate a lie. Here we have a corporate expense listed as an executive wellness retreat in Aspen. I continued highlighting a charge for $12,000. However, the itemized hotel receipt proves the room was booked under Brittany's name. The room service charges include prenatal massages and imported caviar. You authorized this draw using your company credit card. The vice president of operations rubbed his temples. The chief financial officer stared at the screen with his mouth slightly open. They were witnessing the utter destruction of their leader. I clicked the remote again, rapidly flashing through dozens of receipts. Designer handbags logged as client appreciation gifts. Diamond earrings categorized as office supplies. Lavish dinners at 5-star restaurants labeled as investor pitch meetings. Derek slammed his hands down on the mahogany table. "This is a witch hunt," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. He looked wildly around the room, pleading with the executives. "You all know me. You know how hard I work for this company. I am the reason you all have jobs. She is twisting the numbers because she is a bitter, broken woman." He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted with malice. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is just a scorned, barren wife who cannot handle the fact that I moved on. She is entirely empty inside. I spent 11 years chained to a woman who could not even give me a child. Now that my new girlfriend is pregnant with my twins, she is trying to ruin my life out of pure jealous spite. She is broken and she wants to break my company to punish me for being a real man." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The executives did not look at me with pity. They looked at Derek with sheer, unadulterated disgust. The chief financial officer pushed his chair back slightly, creating physical distance from Derek. The female executives stared at him with cold revulsion. Derek looked around expecting agreement, but found only a wall of judgment. His manipulation tactic had failed completely. "Your fertility is not a valid defense for corporate fraud, Derek," I said smoothly, breaking the silence. I clicked to the final slide. The total number appeared in bold red font at the center of the screen. "You did not just buy your mistress a few nice dinners. You systematically drained the operational budget of this firm to fund a fantasy lifestyle you could not afford on your actual salary. The total amount embezzled over the last 6 months comes to exactly $412,000. Derek stared at the red number, his chest heaving. "That is not just a breach of contract," I continued. "That is a federal crime. As the majority shareholder, I have already authorized our legal team to forward this entire unredacted portfolio to the authorities. You will be hearing from them very shortly. But as of this exact second, you no longer work for Sterling Vanguard or any of its subsidiaries." I nodded toward the back of the room. The two large security guards stepped forward immediately. They flanked Derek, grabbing him by his upper arms before he could even attempt to run or fight back. "Hand over your corporate access badge," the taller guard commanded, holding out an open palm. "Your company phone and your laptop stay on the table." Derek struggled against their grip, but they held him firmly in place. He clumsily unclipped the security lanyard from his belt and dropped it onto the table. He pulled his company-issued phone from his pocket and threw it down next to the badge. "You are going to regret this, Fiona," he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "You think taking my job changes anything? I still have my family. I still have my children. You will always be alone. Escort him out." I instructed the guards, ignoring his pathetic final attempt to hurt me. "Do not let him return to his office. He is to leave the premises immediately." The guards hauled Derek away from the table and marched him toward the frosted glass doors. They pulled the doors open and pushed him out into the bustling hallway. The entire open-plan office had gone completely silent. Dozens of software engineers, sales associates, and administrative staff stood at their cubicles watching the spectacle. The man who had walked in demanding respect and luxury condos was now being physically frog-marched through the building like a common criminal. Derek tried to yank his arms free to preserve some shred of dignity, but the guards gave him no quarter. They escorted him straight to the main elevators, rode down to the lobby in complete silence, and shoved him out through the heavy revolving doors onto the rainy city sidewalk. Derek stood in the pouring rain, shivering in his expensive bespoke suit. His custom luxury car was a company lease, and the keys had been surrendered to security. His personal bank accounts were completely frozen. He had no cash to hail a cab. He had no home to return to. He had no job, and a federal investigation looming over his head. Stripped of his wealth, his career, and his meticulously crafted image, Derek clung desperately to his final source of pride. He still had his unborn twins. He still had his legacy. He believed that no matter what I took from him, he had proven his manhood by doing the one thing I could not do. He was going to be a father. He pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket, shielding the screen from the heavy rain. He needed comfort. He needed someone to tell him he was still a king. He needed someone to stroke his ego and promise him that everything would be all right. He bypassed Brittany's contact, knowing she would only demand updates on the luxury condo he had promised her. Instead, he swiped down to the one person who had always worshipped the ground he walked on. He called an economy rideshare service, using an old prepaid debit card linked to his personal phone application. When the battered sedan arrived, he climbed into the back seat, dripping wet and utterly defeated. He gave the driver the address to a quiet, affluent suburb on the other side of the city. He was going to his mother's house. Sylvia was the only person left who would look at him with absolute adoration. He planned to show her the ultrasound photos, to cry on her shoulder about his crazy, vindictive ex-wife, and to bask in her maternal validation. He leaned his head against the cold, damp window of the rideshare, watching the city blur past him. He smiled a weak, pathetic smile, thinking about his children. He was driving frantically toward Sylvia's house, seeking shelter from the storm, completely and entirely unaware of the devastating landmine waiting for him in her kitchen. The battered economy sedan pulled up to the curb of an immaculate two-story brick house situated in a quiet, affluent suburb on the northern edge of the city. Derek shoved the car door open and stepped out into the relentless coastal downpour. He did not bother running up the paved stone walkway. He simply walked at a slow, deliberate pace, letting the freezing rain soak completely through his ruined, bespoke suit. His mind was entirely consumed by the manic, frantic energy buzzing beneath his skin. This house was his absolute sanctuary. His mother, Sylvia, had always been his fiercest defender and his ultimate shield against the harsh realities of the world. When his grade school teachers gave him failing marks, Sylvia had marched into the principal's office and blamed their flawed curriculum. When his very first business venture collapsed a decade ago, she had blamed the unpredictable market and handed him her own savings to start over. Now that his wife had viciously attacked his livelihood and stripped him of his dignity, he knew exactly what Sylvia would do. She would validate him. She would wrap him in a warm embrace, tell him he was brilliant, and confirm that Fiona was the true villain of the story. He pushed the heavy oak front door open without knocking, tracking muddy water onto the pristine hardwood floor of the entryway foyer. "Mom," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly through the quiet, perfectly ordered house. "Mom, where are you?" He found her in the sprawling custom kitchen. The room smelled warmly of vanilla and freshly brewed coffee. Sylvia was a woman who prided herself on absolute domestic perfection. She wore a crisp, beige cashmere cardigan, and her silver hair was perfectly coiffed without a single strand out of place. She gasped, dropping a pair of pruning shears onto the marble island, as her son staggered into the room looking like a drowned rat. "Derek, what on earth happened to you?" Sylvia cried, rushing forward with a clean linen dish towel. "You are completely soaked to the bone. Where is your car? Why are you not at the office?" Derek forcefully waved away her attempts to dry his wet shoulders. He began pacing the length of the massive kitchen, his soaked leather shoes squeaking aggressively against the polished ceramic tile. "It is Fiona!" He spat, his voice trembling with manufactured outrage and deep-seated panic. "She has completely lost her mind, Mom. She has gone utterly and clinically insane. I always knew she was secretly jealous of my massive success, but I never realized how deeply vindictive and evil she truly is." Sylvia gasped, pressing a trembling hand against her chest. "What did she do, Derek? What happened?" "She stole my entire company!" Derek lied through his teeth, spinning the narrative with practiced, desperate ease. "She found some obscure technical legal loophole buried deep in the foundational corporate paperwork from 5 years ago. She used her dirty, high-priced corporate lawyers to freeze all of my personal bank accounts and physically lock me out of my own building. She orchestrated this entire massive conspiracy to humiliate me in front of my own board of directors. She practically had armed security throw me out onto the street like a common criminal. She is trying to leave me with absolutely nothing just because she cannot stand to see me happy and thriving without her." He continued pacing, his gestures growing wilder and more theatrical by the second. He needed his mother to see him as the tragic, innocent hero of this story. He needed her to believe that he had been ambushed by a monster. "But she is not going to win, Mom," Derek declared, his voice rising in volume. "She thinks taking away my bank accounts and my executive title will break me. She thinks because she is a cold, calculating machine, she holds all the power in the world. But she is entirely empty inside. I spent 11 miserable years tied to a woman who cared more about her tedious accounting spreadsheets than building a real family with me. She was completely broken and toxic. But I am not broken. I am moving on, and I am finally building the incredible life I actually deserve." Derek stopped his frantic pacing. He stood directly across the marble island from his mother, planting his feet firmly on the floor. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his soaked suit jacket. His fingers closed around the protective plastic sleeve he had been obsessively carrying all day. He pulled it out with a highly dramatic flourish. He slapped the glossy black and white ultrasound photographs down onto the kitchen counter, right next to the freshly cut flowers. "Fiona took my company," Mom Derek announced, his chest heaving with arrogant pride and absolute defiance. "But it does not matter. Brittany is giving me the twins Fiona was too broken to carry." He stood tall, a triumphant, self-satisfied grin spreading across his wet face. He waited for the sudden gasp of joy. He waited for Sylvia to rush around the marble counter to throw her arms around his neck and weep tears of absolute, overwhelming happiness. He waited for her to tell him that he was finally getting the beautiful legacy he had been denied for so long. But Sylvia did not move. She did not smile. She did not congratulate him. Derek watched her face carefully, his triumphant grin slowly faltering. Sylvia was staring down at the black and white ultrasound images resting on the marble counter. Her hands, which had been resting casually on the edge of the island, began to tremble. It started as a slight nervous tremor in her fingers and rapidly escalated into a violent, uncontrollable shaking. The healthy pink color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly pale white. She looked as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. "Mom?" Derek asked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is wrong? Look at the pictures. You are going to be a grandmother to two beautiful babies." Sylvia slowly lifted her head. She looked up at her son, not with joy or relief or maternal pride, but with a look of absolute unadulterated horror. Her eyes were wide and suddenly welling with panicked, terrified tears. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked back down at the ultrasound photos as if they were a venomous snake, and then back up at Derek. "Wait," Sylvia whispered, her voice breaking into a fragile, breathless rasp that barely carried across the kitchen island. "Fiona did not tell you before she signed the divorce papers." Derek felt a cold, sharp spike of dread pierce his stomach. The absolute sheer terror in his mother's eyes made his heart hammer violently against his ribs. The confident facade he had been wearing all morning began to rapidly disintegrate. "Tell me what," he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, defensive growl. "Tell me what, Mom. What are you talking about?" Sylvia let out a choked, agonizing sob. She covered her mouth with both of her trembling hands, tears spilling over her eyelashes and tracking rapidly down her pale cheeks. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly, and she leaned heavily against the marble island for physical support, her chest heaving with heavy, panicked breaths. "Derek, when you were 14 years old," Sylvia began, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. "Do you remember the terrible summer you spent in the oncology ward at the hospital? The summer you were so incredibly sick, and the doctors told us we were rapidly running out of medical options to save you." Derek stared at her, his mind racing, trying to connect the past to this exact moment. "Of course I remember, Mom. I had an aggressive tumor. I went through 6 brutal months of intensive radiation therapy. The doctors completely eradicated it. They saved my life, and I have been perfectly healthy ever since. What does my childhood illness have to do with Brittany or the twins?" Sylvia closed her eyes, squeezing them shut as if trying to block out the devastating reality of the moment. "The radiation saved your life, Derek," she sobbed, her voice dissolving into pure, wretched despair. "But the treatment was incredibly aggressive. It was highly experimental, and it had to be directly concentrated on your lower abdomen to target the mass. The oncologists warned your father and me about the severe permanent side effects, but we had absolutely no choice. We had to sign the consent forms. We had to save your life." Derek felt his throat go completely dry. The luxurious kitchen began to spin slowly around him. "What side effects?" he demanded, taking a slow, heavy step closer to the island. "Tell me right now." Sylvia opened her eyes, looking at the grown son she had fiercely protected his entire life. "The radiation permanently destroyed your reproductive system, Derek. You are 100% irreversibly sterile. You have been since you were 14 years old." Derek stopped breathing. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "You cannot father children, Derek." Sylvia wept, clutching the edge of the counter. "It is a biological and medical impossibility. You have a 0% sperm count. We hid the medical files from you because we wanted you to have a normal high school experience. We wanted to protect your pride. When you married Fiona, I sat her down privately and told her the absolute truth. I begged her to keep the secret and to look into adoption when the time was right, so you would never feel inadequate. She agreed to carry the burden of your infertility so you would never have to feel like less of a man." Derek stared at the black and white ultrasound photos resting on the marble counter, the images of the twins. The twins that Brittany had tearfully sworn were the product of their passionate secret romance. The twins that Brittany claimed were his ultimate legacy. The twins that he had just destroyed his entire marriage, his career, and his financial future to protect and provide for. He cannot father children. The realization crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. Brittany had not chosen him because he was a wealthy, handsome titan of industry. Brittany had chosen him because she was already pregnant with another man's children, and she desperately needed a rich, arrogant, gullible fool to pay for her luxury lifestyle. And he had handed her the keys to his entire life on a silver platter. The silence in the immaculate kitchen was absolute. Derek stood frozen, staring at his mother as her devastating words dismantled his entire reality piece by piece. The arrogant foundation upon which he had built his entire life crumbled into dust. He could not process the medical truth echoing off the marble countertops. He was completely irreversibly sterile. "But we did IVF." Derek stammered, his voice sounding hollow and completely foreign to his own ears. "We went through 4 rounds. The doctors told us the embryos were not viable. They told us it was Fiona." Sylvia shook her head slowly, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, Derek. They told you the donor embryos were not viable. You and Fiona agreed to use an anonymous sperm donor because of your medical history. But your ego could not handle the reality of your condition. You willfully blocked out the truth. You convinced yourself the failure was entirely on Fiona. And Fiona let you believe it because she loved you enough to protect your fragile pride." Derek stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the heavy wooden pantry door. Memories from the past decade flashed through his mind with brutal, unforgiving clarity. He remembered his father Richard constantly making passive-aggressive jokes about Fiona being barren at family dinners. He remembered his mother Linda openly criticizing Fiona for prioritizing her accounting firm over giving him a family. He remembered sitting at the head of holiday tables, nodding solemnly while his family verbally shredded his wife for her supposed biological failures. Fiona had sat there and taken every single insult in absolute silence. She had endured 11 years of relentless mockery and condescension from his parents, never once revealing the medical secret that would have completely destroyed his masculine pride. She had shielded him from his own family's judgment, absorbing their toxic abuse to protect the man she loved. And how had he repaid her absolute loyalty? He had publicly humiliated her. He had paraded her younger sister onto a stage, proudly claiming he had finally found a real woman capable of giving him the legacy he deserved. Bile rose in Derek's throat, thick and acidic. He had thrown away a brilliant, fiercely loyal woman who built his entire empire in secret, all for a pathetic lie. "Give me the files!" Derek demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, vibrating growl. "Give me my childhood medical records right now." Sylvia frantically pulled open a heavy mahogany drawer and produced a thick, yellowed manila folder. Derek snatched it from her trembling hands without another word. He did not ask for a towel. He did not ask for coffee. He turned on his heel and marched out of the kitchen, tracking mud and rainwater back through the foyer. The drive to Brittany's cramped, overpriced downtown apartment was a blur of blinding rage. The rain lashed violently against the windshield of his economy rideshare, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the absolute fury boiling inside his chest. He had been played for an absolute fool. He had burned his marriage to the ground, lost his entire fortune, and exposed himself to federal embezzlement charges, all to fund a luxury lifestyle for another man's children. Derek practically kicked the door of the rideshare open before it came to a complete stop at the curb. He marched into the lobby of Brittany's building, bypassing the front desk and taking the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached her floor, he did not bother knocking. He pounded his fist heavily against the cheap wooden door. Brittany pulled the door open a few seconds later. She was wearing a silk robe he had purchased for her last month using stolen corporate funds. Several large designer suitcases were open on the living room floor, half packed with the expensive clothes and imported shoes he had funded. Derek, finally. Brittany sighed, rolling her eyes and completely ignoring his drenched, disheveled appearance. "Did you get the keys to the penthouse? The movers are charging me by the hour to keep this reservation open, and I absolutely refuse to spend another night in this tiny dump. Tell me you brought the corporate card." Derek pushed past her, stepping heavily into the small living room. He did not say a word about the penthouse. He did not mention the money. He simply raised his arm and violently slammed the thick manila folder down onto her glass coffee table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. "Open it," Derek commanded, his voice dripping with venom. Brittany jumped, crossing her arms defensively over her slightly rounded stomach. "What is your problem, Derek? You are tracking water all over my rug." "I said open the damn folder, Brittany." Derek roared, stepping toward her with a look of such pure, unhinged fury that she instinctively shrank back. Trembling slightly, Brittany reached out and flipped open the yellowed cover. She stared at the top document. It was a comprehensive pediatric oncology report from an elite metropolitan hospital detailing his aggressive radiation therapy and outlining the permanent, irreversible destruction of his reproductive system. Derek watched her face intensely. He waited for the confusion. He waited for her to ask what this meant. He waited for her to deny understanding the medical jargon. Instead, Brittany's delicate, innocent facade completely evaporated. The feigned sweetness drained from her features, replaced by a cold, hard, calculating stare. She dropped the medical file back onto the table and let out a long, heavy sigh of pure annoyance. She did not look guilty. She looked entirely inconvenienced. "So you found out," Brittany stated flatly, crossing her arms over her chest. "I honestly figured Fiona would have rubbed your face in this years ago. She always loved being the smartest person in the room." Derek felt the floor drop out from underneath him. "You knew," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You knew I was sterile this entire time." "Of course I knew," Brittany laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made his stomach churn. "Fiona told me the truth about your little medical condition years ago, after she had a few too many glasses of wine at Thanksgiving. She was crying about how hard it was to protect your pathetic, fragile ego from Mom and Dad. Do you honestly think I would have risked my own future sleeping with you if I thought you could actually get me pregnant?" "Who is the father?" Derek demanded, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. "Tell me right now." Brittany rolled her eyes again, walking over to her kitchen counter to pour herself a glass of sparkling water. "His name is Marcus. He is a VIP promoter at that downtown club I used to go to. He is broke. He is married to some terrifying woman, and the second I told him I was late, he completely blocked my number across every single platform. He literally threatened to file a restraining order if I ever showed up at his club again." "You used me!" Derek gasped, the magnitude of her manipulation finally sinking in. "You targeted me because you needed a bailout. I targeted you because you were the easiest, most arrogant mark I had ever met in my entire life." Brittany shot back, turning to glare at him with absolute disdain. "I was pregnant, broke, and drowning in credit card debt. I needed a wealthy savior to fund my lifestyle and pay for these twins. You were constantly strutting around family dinners, bragging about your tech empire and your massive corporate expense accounts. You were practically begging to be manipulated. All I had to do was stroke your massive ego, tell you that you were a brilliant visionary, and pretend that you were so much more of a man than Fiona ever appreciated. You ate it up instantly. You were so desperate to prove your virility that you did not even question the timeline." Derek felt physically sick. He had destroyed his entire existence for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a gullible ATM. He had proudly paraded her in front of his elite social circles, boasting about a biological miracle that was actually a calculated, desperate scam by a broke club promoter's mistress. "Well, the joke is entirely on you, Brittany." Derek sneered desperately, trying to reclaim a shred of his shattered pride. "You think you secured a wealthy savior. You think you are moving into a luxury penthouse today. You get absolutely nothing. I am cutting you off right this second. I am canceling the movers, I am returning the Range Rover, and I am not paying another single dime for your rent. Good luck raising a promoter's bastard twins on your own." Brittany slammed her glass down on the counter, her eyes flashing with a sudden vicious panic. "You cannot do that, Derek. You promised me. I have texts. I will take you to court for palimony. You are the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar tech firm. You have massive corporate accounts. You have to pay for my lifestyle. You owe me." "I do not have a company anymore." Derek screamed, his voice cracking with the sheer agonizing reality of his situation. "I do not have massive corporate accounts. Fiona owns the entire holding firm. She owned my debt, she owned my patents, and she owned my building. I was just a salaried employee, and she officially fired me this morning in front of my entire board of directors. She froze all my personal accounts, she stripped my corporate cards, and she is pressing federal charges against me for the $400,000 I embezzled to buy your designer bags and hotel suites." Brittany stared at him, her mouth hanging open, the color completely drained from her face. "You are broke," she whispered, her voice laced with absolute horror. "You are completely broke and you are going to federal prison." "I have nothing," Derek admitted, his shoulders slumping as the fight finally left his body. Fiona took everything. The transition was instantaneous. Brittany's face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious disgust. She marched across the living room, grabbed Derek by the lapels of his ruin-soaked suit, and shoved him violently toward the front door. "Get out!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing down the apartment hallway. "You are completely useless to me. You are a pathetic, broke loser who does not even own his own company. You let your boring accountant wife play you like an absolute fiddle, and now you are dragging me down with you. I cannot afford to be attached to a federal criminal with zero assets." "Brittany, wait," Derek pleaded, suddenly terrified of being entirely alone. "I said get out of my apartment," she screamed, shoving him hard out into the hallway. "Do not ever contact me again. If you come near me, I will call the police." She slammed the heavy door directly in his face. The sharp click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the quiet hallway. Derek stood alone in the dim corridor, his expensive suit clinging wetly to his skin. He had no company, no money, no wife, no children, and no future. He was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable realization that Fiona had not just defeated him, she had utterly annihilated him. The heavy silence of the dimly lit hallway was shattered by the sharp chime of the elevator arriving at the end of the corridor. The polished metal doors slid open and Richard and Linda rushed out, their faces pale with frantic worry. They had raced across the city the moment they received the hysterical phone call about Derek being locked out of his own building. They hurried down the hallway and stopped dead in their tracks when they saw their golden child leaning against the wallpaper, completely drenched, shivering, and looking utterly defeated. Linda let out a high-pitched gasp. She ran forward and threw her arms around Derek, heedless of his soaking wetsuit. She cradled his face in her hands, treating the 35-year-old former executive as if he were a bruised toddler. "Derek, my God, what has that monster done to you?" Linda cried, her voice echoing shrilly against the apartment doors. "Look at you. You are freezing. You are shaking." Richard stepped up beside his wife, his chest puffed out with arrogant patriarchal fury. His face was a deep shade of crimson. He stared at the closed door of Brittany's apartment and then back at his son. "Did that girl just throw you out?" Richard demanded, his voice booming with absolute authority. "After everything you have done for her, after you sacrificed your marriage to give her the world, I will not tolerate anyone treating my son like a stray dog. Stand aside, Derek." Richard marched directly up to Brittany's door and pounded his heavy fist against the wood. He hammered relentlessly, ignoring the muffled protests from neighboring units. "Open this door immediately," Richard bellowed. "You do not get to disrespect this family. We are the ones who put a roof over your head." The deadbolt clicked. The door swung open a few inches, revealing Brittany. Her eyes darted from the soaked, pathetic figure of Derek to the expensive designer coats and furious faces of Richard and Linda. Brittany possessed a predatory survival instinct. She rapidly calculated the situation. Derek was broke, but his parents owned a highly successful commercial construction business. They lived in a sprawling mansion. They were wealthy. If she played her cards perfectly, she could bypass Derek entirely and tap directly into the family fortune. Instantly, Brittany's cold, vicious expression melted away. Her lower lip began to quiver. She opened the door wider, leaning against the frame as tears welled up in her eyes and spilled dramatically down her cheeks. "I am so sorry," Brittany sobbed, her voice breaking into a fragile, helpless whimper. "I did not want to kick him out. I am just so terrified. I am pregnant with your grandchildren and I am completely traumatized." Linda's protective maternal rage wavered. She stepped closer, eyeing Brittany's slightly rounded stomach. "What are you talking about?" Linda asked. "Why did you lock my son out in the cold?" "Because he lied to me," Brittany cried, covering her face with her hands and weeping loudly. "He told me he was a wealthy chief executive officer. He told me he was in complete control of his life. But it was a trap. Fiona orchestrated this entire nightmare. She knew about me. She knew about the babies. She deliberately waited until I was entirely dependent on Derek, and then she pulled the rug out from under us. She orchestrated this massive corporate scandal just to leave me and my unborn children destitute on the street. Brittany pointed a trembling accusatory finger at Derek, who was staring at her in mute, horrified disbelief. He could not form the words to expose her lies. The shock of his sterility had paralyzed his brain. He let Fiona manipulate him. Brittany continued playing the desperate victim flawlessly. Fiona set him up to take the fall for the corporate accounts. She tricked him into signing those papers. And now Fiona has frozen everything. The movers are canceling my lease. I have no money for medical care. Fiona is trying to destroy your legacy, and Derek was too weak to stop her. Richard's face tightened with absolute righteous fury. The narrative fit perfectly into his deeply ingrained worldview. His son was not a failure. His son was a victim of a calculating, vindictive woman. Fiona had always been too smart, too independent, and too cold for his liking. Now she had dared to attack his family and jeopardize his unborn grandchildren. "That is enough," Richard declared, raising his hand to silence Brittany's manufactured sobs. "Do not shed another tear, young lady. You are carrying the next generation of our family, and I will not allow that bitter, barren woman to ruin our lives. Fiona thinks she is a brilliant corporate strategist. She thinks she can use some petty boardroom politics to humiliate my son. She has absolutely no idea who she is dealing with." Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored cashmere overcoat and pulled out his phone. He possessed the unearned confidence of a man who had bullied his way through life using money and intimidation. He unlocked his screen and aggressively tapped a contact name. "What are you doing?" Derek finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I am ending this right now," Richard stated, projecting his voice so both Brittany and Linda could hear his authority. "I am calling Arthur. He is the most ruthless corporate litigator in the city. I am going to instruct him to launch a massive scorched earth lawsuit against Fiona's holding company. We will sue her for wrongful termination, defamation, hostile takeover, and emotional distress. I will tie her up in endless litigation until she is begging for mercy. I will bankrupt her firm and hand it back to you." The phone rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Arthur speaking." "Arthur." "It is." "Richard," he barked, tapping the speakerphone button so the entire hallway could hear his display of power. "I need you to draft a comprehensive lawsuit immediately. My former daughter-in-law, Fiona, has completely lost her mind. She executed an illegal hostile takeover of my son's firm today. She locked him out and froze his assets. I want you to go after her holding company with everything you have. We are going to destroy her business and take back what belongs to my son." There was a heavy, prolonged silence on the other end of the line. The quiet stretched on for so long that Richard checked his screen to ensure the call had not dropped. "Arthur," Richard prompted impatiently. "Did you hear my instructions?" "I heard you," Richard the lawyer finally replied. His voice was completely devoid of its usual deferential tone. It sounded incredibly weary and tightly strained. "And I am telling you that what you are asking is a legal and financial impossibility. You cannot sue Fiona's holding company." "What are you talking about?" Richard snapped, his face flushing with fresh anger. "I pay you a massive retainer to destroy my enemies. Do not tell me what I cannot do. She operates a mid-level corporate umbrella firm. File the injunctions immediately." Richard listened to me very carefully. Arthur said, his words sharp and deliberate. "You cannot sue that holding company because you do not possess the financial leverage to fight them. 3 years ago, your commercial construction business was on the verge of total bankruptcy. You were bleeding capital, your contracts dried up, and traditional banks refused to touch you. You came to me desperate for a lifeline." I remember Richard growled defensively, "and we secured a massive private line of credit from an anonymous equity group. It saved the business." "What does that have to do with Fiona?" "Because it was not an anonymous equity group," Arthur stated flatly, his voice echoing coldly down the hallway. "The private equity firm that underwrote your massive line of credit is a direct subsidiary of Fiona's holding company." Richard froze. The arrogant posture completely vanished from his frame. Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Fiona's firm owns your debt, Richard the lawyer continued, driving the brutal reality home. She controls the entire financial foundation of your construction business. She has the power to call in the remainder of that loan at any given moment. But that is not even the worst part. Richard could barely breathe. What could possibly be worse than that? He rasped, the booming authority entirely gone from his voice. The $400,000 that Derek embezzled from his company, Arthur explained, his tone devoid of any sympathy. Derek did not just take that money, he committed federal corporate fraud. Because the theft has been officially logged and forwarded to the authorities, the parent holding company is legally obligated to recover the stolen assets immediately. That is Derek's problem, Richard stammered, stepping backward as if physically struck. He took the money. I had nothing to do with his corporate accounts. You had everything to do with it, Arthur corrected sharply. 5 years ago, when Derek launched his startup, he lacked the credit history to secure the initial foundational loans. You and Linda secretly co-signed those original financial documents to ensure his success. You used your commercial construction business as the primary collateral for his corporate entity. You tied your family business directly to his corporate liability. The hallway began to spin around Richard. Derek slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. Brittany stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she rapidly processed the financial math. Because you co-signed those foundational loans, Arthur delivered the final crushing blow. You are legally, personally, and corporately liable for Derek's debts. Fiona's firm is calling in the $400,000 your son embezzled. You have exactly 48 hours to wire the full unredacted amount to the holding company. If you fail to produce the cash, Fiona will execute the collateral clause. She will seize your construction business, liquidate your commercial assets, and place a lien on your personal mansion. You have absolutely no legal standing to fight this. She holds all the cards. Arthur hung up. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. Richard dropped his phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. He turned and stared at Derek, the son he had worshipped, the son he had defended, the son who had just cost him his entire life's work. Linda burst into hysterical, uncontrollable tears, realizing their wealth, their home, and their status were entirely gone. Brittany did not shed another tear. The delicate, victimized pregnant woman vanished instantly. She looked at the 3 broken, sobbing, destitute people standing in front of her apartment. She realized Derek was broke, fired, facing federal charges, and his parents were about to lose their mansion and their business. There was absolutely no money left to extract. You are all completely pathetic, Brittany sneered, her voice hard and vicious. She stepped back into her apartment and looked down at Derek with sheer revulsion. You are entirely useless to me. She slammed the door shut and the deadbolt slid into place with a heavy, permanent click. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking echoed down the dim apartment hallway, sealing Derek's fate permanently. Richard stared at the closed door of Brittany's apartment. The reality of their total financial ruin washed over him completely, extinguishing his prior rage. The arrogant patriarchal fire that had fueled him for decades was suddenly replaced by cold, suffocating terror. He turned to his wife. Linda was leaning against the floral wallpaper, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Her designer purse had slipped from her shoulder and lay discarded on the carpet. Derek remained motionless on the floor, staring blankly at the wall. His expensive suit was still dripping wet, forming a dark puddle around his leather shoes. Richard realized instantly that Derek was entirely broken. His son could not fix this catastrophic mess. His son had caused it. Richard knew he had to save his own empire. He had spent 30 years building his commercial construction business from the ground up. He refused to lose his legacy because of a vindictive former daughter-in-law. He grabbed Linda roughly by the arm, hauling her away from the wall and dragging her toward the elevator. They were going to see Fiona. They were going to fix this. Fiona's corporate headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, modern glass high-rise located squarely in the city's bustling financial district. Richard and Linda burst through the heavy revolving glass doors of the executive suite, completely bypassing a startled security guard. They looked like absolute wrecks. Richard's tailored cashmere overcoat was wrinkled and damp from the coastal rain. Linda's expensive makeup was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. They pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors to Fiona's personal corner office without bothering to knock. Fiona sat behind a massive desk carved from solid, polished obsidian. She wore an impeccable tailored ivory suit that radiated absolute authority and control. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sharp, elegant chignon without a single strand out of place. She did not flinch when the heavy doors slammed against the walls. She simply looked up from her digital tablet, her expression completely unbothered. The panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows behind her framed the gray, stormy city skyline, casting her in a cool, commanding light. Richard and Linda practically collapsed into the plush leather guest chairs opposite her desk. Gone was the blistering arrogance they had displayed for 11 years. Gone was the condescending tone they had always used to remind Fiona that she was nothing but a boring accountant who was lucky to have secured a man like Derek. Now they were weeping. "Fiona, please," Linda begged, her voice cracking as she leaned forward, pressing her hands flat against the cold obsidian desk. "You have to stop this. You have to be the bigger person. We are family. We have always been a family." Fiona folded her hands, neatly resting them on top of her tablet. "We ceased being family the moment you helped your son hide his embezzlement to fund a mistress," Fiona stated, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "It was a mistake," Richard pleaded, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "Derek made a terrible, foolish mistake. But you are destroying our entire lives over a moment of weakness. You have to drop the embezzlement charges against him. If you do not drop the federal charges, he will go to prison. He will not survive in there, Fiona. You know how sensitive he is." Linda nodded frantically, tears splashing onto the pristine surface of the desk. "And you have to forgive the debt on our construction firm. You cannot take our business, Fiona. We worked for 30 grueling years to build that company. It is our retirement. It is our entire legacy. Please show some mercy." "And the babies." Linda choked on a heavy sob, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. "Brittany threw him out. She has absolutely nothing. You are a wealthy woman now. You own this entire holding company. Out of basic family loyalty, you need to provide a monthly stipend for those twins. They are innocent in all of this. They are Derek's children." "Derek's children," Fiona repeated. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the precise surgical smile of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a trap. "Yes," Linda cried, leaning further over the desk. "Your niece and nephew. You cannot leave them destitute on the street." Fiona leaned back slowly in her high-backed leather executive chair. She looked at them with sheer clinical detachment. "You spent my entire life calling me a disappointment," Fiona stated, her voice ringing clearly in the large, quiet office. "For 11 years, you sat at the head of holiday tables and openly mocked my career. You told your country club friends I was a glorified bookkeeper. You made passive-aggressive jokes about my body, implying I was less of a woman because I could not give you the grandchildren you so desperately craved. You watched me endure countless rounds of painful, invasive fertility treatments. You watched me inject myself with hormones until my stomach was bruised and I was violently sick. And every single time a cycle failed, you looked at me with absolute sheer disgust." Linda opened her mouth to protest, but Fiona raised a single perfectly manicured finger, commanding immediate absolute silence. "You did all of that," Fiona continued smoothly, "while I kept the ultimate secret. I endured your toxic abuse to protect your son. I kept his pediatric oncology records locked away. I carried the heavy burden of his total irreversible sterility so he would never have to feel like a failure in your eyes. I was the one protecting him. I was the one protecting your pristine family image." Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the undeniable truth of Fiona's unwavering loyalty fully materialized in his mind. "And how did you reward that loyalty?" Fiona asked, her tone dropping into a deadly, razor-sharp whisper. "You worshipped Brittany's lies and punished my loyalty. You embraced a woman who saw your son as nothing more than an easy target. You bought her transparent lies about a biological miracle because your massive egos demanded it. You celebrated my replacement before the ink on the divorce papers was even dry. You actively encouraged Derek to drain his corporate accounts to keep her happy. We did not know. Richard stammered, sweat beating rapidly on his forehead. Fiona, I swear to God, we did not know he was stealing from the company to pay for her lifestyle. You knew he could not afford a custom Range Rover and luxury hotel penthouses on his basic salary. Fiona countered instantly, shutting down his weak defense. You chose to look the other way because Brittany played the part of the perfect fertile golden child. You wanted the fantasy so badly, you actively participated in destroying the reality we had built. Fiona stood up gracefully. She smoothed the front of her ivory suit jacket. She walked slowly around the massive obsidian desk, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. She stopped directly in front of Richard and Linda, looking down at them. You storm into my office and demand that I drop federal criminal charges, Fiona said, ticking the items off on her fingers. You demand that I forgive a $400,000 debt that you legally co-signed using your own business as collateral. You demand that I provide a monthly financial stipend for twins that are biologically impossible for your son to have fathered, twins that belong to a broke married club promoter. Linda gasped, the final shred of her delusion evaporating into the cold air of the office. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide with total, horrific comprehension. You are not asking for family loyalty, Fiona stated. You are asking me to finance your delusions. You are asking me to clean up the catastrophic mess you created by enabling your arrogant, entitled son. Fiona, I am begging you, Richard whispered, his voice completely broken, stripped of all its former power. We have absolutely nothing left. We will do whatever you want. We will publicly apologize to you. We will sign over our shares. Just let us keep our home. Let us keep our business. Fiona stared at him. Her expression was carved from solid ice. No, Fiona said simply. You spent my entire life calling me a disappointment. Now you get to live with your true legacy. Fiona turned her back on them and walked purposefully behind her desk. She reached out and pressed a small silver button on her intercom console. Send them in, she instructed. Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy frosted glass doors of the office swung open. A team of 3 corporate attorneys walked into the room. They wore dark, sharply tailored suits and carried thick leather briefcases. They moved with absolute military precision, fanning out as they approached the guest chairs where Richard and Linda sat frozen in terror. The lead attorney, a tall woman with a severe expression, pulled a stack of heavily stamped legal documents from her briefcase. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply dropped the thick, heavy pile of paperwork directly into Richard's trembling lap. Richard and Linda Sterling, the lead attorney, announced, her voice echoing with absolute legal finality. You are hereby served with formal foreclosure notices regarding Sterling Commercial Construction. Due to your failure to produce the required $400,000 within the legally mandated timeframe, my client has officially executed the collateral clause on your foundational loans. We have officially seized all commercial assets, frozen your operating accounts, and initiated the rapid liquidation of your heavy machinery. Furthermore, the secondary lien on your personal residence has been activated, and eviction proceedings will commence immediately. Richard stared down at the documents in his lap. The bold red ink stamped across the front page screamed foreclosure and asset seizure. He could not lift his hands to touch the paper. His arms hung limply at his sides. His mouth opened and closed, but no words formed. Please, Linda wailed, slipping out of her leather guest chair and dropping heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor. She reached out, trying desperately to grab the hem of Fiona's tailored trousers. Please, Fiona, we will be homeless. You cannot put us out on the street. Fiona took a calculated step backward, ensuring Linda's frantic hands grasped nothing but empty air. She looked down at the weeping, shattered woman kneeling on her office floor. Security will escort you off the premises, Fiona stated, her voice as calm and steady as a ticking clock. Do not ever return to my building. 2 towering security guards in dark suits stepped forward immediately. They flanked Richard and Linda, their expressions stoic and unyielding. Richard tried to shrug them off, attempting to summon one last shred of his former patriarchal authority, but his legs trembled so violently he could barely stand. Linda wept openly, her sobs echoing down the pristine glass hallway as the guards firmly guided them toward the executive elevators. The polished steel doors slid shut on their devastated faces, sealing the absolute destruction of the Sterling family legacy. Fiona remained at her obsidian desk, her posture perfect, her expression completely serene. The financial dominoes she had meticulously lined up over the past 6 months had finally toppled, crushing everything in their path. Across the city, the reality of the Sterling family's annihilation was crashing down on Brittany. She sat on the floor of her cramped apartment surrounded by half-packed designer suitcases. The moving company had just called to cancel her penthouse reservation. The deposit check Derek had written had bounced spectacularly. When she tried to use the Platinum corporate credit card to rebook the movers, the automated system informed her the account was permanently closed due to suspected fraudulent activity. Brittany frantically scrolled through her phone, checking her banking applications. Every single account linked to Derek was frozen. Her personal savings account held less than $40. She was pregnant, her rent was 3 weeks past due, and the property manager had already slipped a bright pink eviction warning under her front door. She had spent the last 6 months living in a complete delusion, believing she had secured a permanent ticket to the elite upper class. Now she was staring at absolute destitution. But Brittany possessed a highly predatory survival instinct. She had built a modest social media following over the years by posting heavily filtered photos of her luxury shopping sprees and five-star dinners. She knew exactly how the internet worked. She knew how much the public loved a tragic story, especially one featuring a vulnerable pregnant victim and a wealthy, cold-hearted villain. If she could not extract cash from Derek or his bankrupt parents, she would extract it from the public. She would weaponize her followers and launch a digital crusade against the woman who had ruined her perfect setup. Brittany set up her professional ring light in the center of her dim living room. She deliberately wiped away her expensive makeup, leaving dark, pathetic smudges under her eyes. She messed up her perfectly styled hair so it hung limply around her pale face. She positioned the camera to clearly capture the half-packed suitcases and the eviction notice resting on the coffee table. She hit record. For the first 10 seconds, Brittany simply sat in front of the lens, her lower lip quivering as she forced large, heavy tears to spill down her cheeks. "I did not want to make this video," Brittany began, her voice shaking with expertly manufactured trauma. "But I have absolutely nowhere else to turn. I am pregnant with twins, and I am about to be completely homeless." She took a ragged, dramatic breath, looking directly into the lens. "The man I loved was destroyed by his evil, barren ex-wife, Brittany," sobbed using the cruelest buzzword she could weaponize. "She could not give him the family he desperately wanted, so she punished us. She used her massive corporate wealth to execute an illegal, hostile takeover of his company. She froze his bank accounts. She stole the money that was supposed to pay for my medical care and my hospital bills. She left a pregnant woman to starve in the street out of pure malicious jealousy. She is a cold, empty monster, and she is trying to ruin my life just because I can give him the babies she never could." Brittany posted the video across every major platform, attaching a link to a crowdfunding campaign titled "Help Save My Twins." She tagged Fiona's holding company, Derek's former firm, and several prominent local news outlets. The internet reacted with terrifying, predictable speed. Within 3 hours, the video had amassed over 2 million views. The comment sections were a raging wildfire of absolute blind outrage. Thousands of anonymous users flooded Fiona's corporate social media pages, leaving highly abusive comments threatening her life and demanding she return the stolen money to the vulnerable pregnant mother. Several mid-tier influencers stitched Brittany's video, weeping on camera, and urging their massive audiences to boycott Fiona's holding firm. The digital mob was hungry for a villain, and Brittany had served Fiona up on a silver platter. Inside her corner office, Fiona watched the viral video playing on her digital tablet. Her public relations director, a sharp, anxious man named Marcus, paced nervously in front of the obsidian desk. "This is a massive public relations nightmare," Fiona Marcus stated, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We are losing corporate followers by the second. The public is entirely on her side. They see a crying pregnant woman and a wealthy female executive, and they have already drawn their conclusions. We need to issue a highly sympathetic apology immediately. We need to offer a small financial settlement to make this go away. If we do not kill this story right now, it will impact our quarterly shareholder meetings." Fiona locked the screen of her tablet and set it face down on the desk. She did not look worried. She looked profoundly bored. "We are not issuing an apology," Marcus Fiona stated, her voice as hard as diamond. "And we are certainly not offering a financial settlement to a grifter who just publicly defamed my entire corporation." "But the public backlash," Marcus stammered. "The public is reacting to a carefully constructed lie," Fiona interrupted smoothly. "They are operating on a severe deficit of factual information. We are going to correct that deficit immediately. Call the legal department. Tell them to execute Protocol Vanguard." Fiona did not film a crying video in her bedroom. She did not take to social media to argue with teenagers in the comment sections. She utilized the full, terrifying power of a multi-million-dollar corporate legal department. Less than 2 hours after Britney's video peaked in viral popularity, Fiona's firm released a formal public cease and desist order. It was published directly to the company's official website and immediately syndicated to every major news outlet that had covered the initial controversy. The document was a masterclass in absolute legal destruction. The press release did not attack Britney's character. It simply presented a timeline of undeniable clinical receipts. Exhibit A featured redacted but highly legible bank statements, proving that the money Britney claimed was stolen was actually $400,000 of embezzled corporate funds. The statements tracked the stolen money directly from Derek's corporate accounts to Britney's luxury car leases, designer handbag purchases, and five-star hotel reservations. Exhibit B was a heavily vetted, legally verified paternity timeline. It included sworn notarized affidavits from the elite oncology hospital where Derek had been treated at age 14, confirming his absolute irreversible sterility. Exhibit C was the killing blow. It was a series of recovered text messages between Britney and Marcus, the married downtown club promoter. The messages, legally obtained during the initial embezzlement discovery phase, explicitly outlined Britney's plan to trap Derek. The texts featured Britney bragging to the promoter about tricking the wealthy, gullible executive into paying for the promoter's unborn twins. The corporate statement ended with a simple, devastating paragraph. The holding firm would be actively pursuing criminal fraud and extortion charges against Britney for her role in the embezzlement scheme and her subsequent attempts to incite digital harassment against the corporation. The internet, which had been rabidly defending Britney just hours prior, stopped dead in its tracks. The digital mob read the comprehensive legal documents, stared at the brutal receipts, and instantly pivoted. The backlash reversed direction with the speed and violence of a hurricane. The very influencers who had wept for Britney deleted their videos in absolute panic, rapidly posting frantic apologies to Fiona's holding company to avoid being named in the impending defamation lawsuits. The crowdfunding campaign Britney had launched was flagged for extreme fraud, locked by the hosting platform, and all donations were immediately refunded to the original senders. Britney watched her phone screen in sheer suffocating horror. Her comment sections, previously filled with hearts and prayers, were now an endless scrolling wall of absolute disgust. People were calling her a sociopath, a criminal, and a homewrecker. The same public that had validated her victimhood was now viciously tearing her apart. Her sponsors, a handful of boutique maternity brands and skincare companies, dropped her, instantly issuing public statements condemning her fraudulent actions. Her phone began ringing relentlessly, but it was not her supportive followers. It was local journalists demanding a comment on the embezzlement charges. It was the club promoter threatening to sue her for exposing his affair. It was the local police department calling to ask a few preliminary questions regarding the stolen corporate funds. Brittany threw her phone across the living room, watching it shatter against the drywall. She sank to the floor amidst her half-packed luggage entirely alone. She had tried to outsmart a brilliant, calculating woman by playing the victim, and in doing so, she had broadcast her own crimes to the entire world. The public humiliation she had so desperately tried to inflict upon Fiona had been magnified 1,000-fold and reflected directly back onto herself. She had absolutely nowhere left to run. The crisp autumn wind howled through the concrete canyons of the financial district, biting viciously through the thin, cheap polyester of Derek's mandatory retail uniform. He stood shivering on the corner of the busy intersection, his hands jammed deep into the pockets of his stained khaki trousers. His feet ached with a dull, throbbing intensity inside his unsupportive off-brand sneakers. A month ago, Derek had commanded a corner office. He wore $4,000 bespoke suits, drove a luxury car, and barked orders at a legion of terrified subordinates. Now he spent 10 grueling hours a day unloading heavy boxes of fertilizer and sweeping the concrete aisles of a massive big-box hardware store. His nights were spent in a squalid, pest-infested motel situated right next to a deafening interstate highway. He lived on instant noodles and tap water, meticulously counting his pennies just to afford the bus fare to work. He was a convicted federal fraudster, working a minimum wage job entirely to pay off a mountain of court-ordered restitution and crushing legal fees. He shifted his weight, his bloodshot eyes locked obsessively on the glass doors of an upscale artisanal coffee roaster across the street. He knew Fiona's schedule. He knew she stopped here every single Tuesday morning before heading up to her corporate headquarters. The heavy glass door swung open. Fiona stepped out onto the bustling pavement. She was a vision of absolute untouchable power. She wore a tailored charcoal wool trench coat over a sharp, immaculate burgundy sheath dress. Her dark hair was styled in a flawless, elegant blowout. She held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, and her sleek leather briefcase in the other. She radiated a quiet, lethal authority that made the busy pedestrians naturally part to give her space. Derek stepped off the curb and hurried across the damp asphalt, his cheap rubber soles slapping loudly against the street. "Fiona," he called out, his voice cracking with a pathetic, hollow desperation. Fiona stopped. She did not flinch. She did not look surprised or alarmed. She slowly turned her head and assessed the trembling, broken man approaching her. Her eyes were as cold and unreadable as polished obsidian. "Derek," she replied, her tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "You are blocking the crosswalk." Derek shrank under her glacial gaze. He looked at her immaculate, wealthy presentation, then looked down at his own frayed collar and stained uniform. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of actually touching the sleeve of her expensive coat. "Fiona, please." Derek begged, his voice dissolving into a wet, ragged sob. "I just need 5 minutes of your time. I have been waiting out here in the freezing cold all morning. I am begging you. I need to talk to you." "You have exactly 1 minute," Fiona stated, taking a slow, measured sip of her coffee. "Speak." Derek launched into a frantic, weeping monologue. He spilled every pathetic detail of his miserable existence. He told her about the roaches in his motel room, the agonizing back pain from unloading freight trucks, and the sheer humiliation of serving customers who used to be his corporate peers. Then he shifted the blame. "She manipulated me!" Fiona, Derek cried, gesturing wildly with his hands. "Brittany is an absolute predator. She is a sociopath. She seduced me and fed on my deepest, darkest insecurities. You know how broken I felt inside?" Derek continued, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "You know how much my medical condition destroyed my self-esteem and my sense of manhood. I was weak and terrified. She used that medical weakness to blind me. I never wanted to hurt you, Fiona. I swear to God, I never wanted to ruin our marriage. I just wanted to feel like a real man for once in my life, and she spun a web of lies that I was too stupid to see through. I miss you, Fiona. I miss my real wife." Fiona did not offer a single ounce of pity. She did not raise her voice or show a flicker of anger. She simply dissected him with surgical precision. "You were not blinded by a web of lies," Fiona stated smoothly. "You were blinded by your own colossal, incredibly fragile ego." She stepped one pace closer, forcing Derek to look directly into her unyielding eyes. "Do not stand on this street corner and play the tragic victim of seduction," Fiona commanded. "I spent 11 years of my life fiercely guarding your medical secret. I endured your parents' relentless toxic abuse in absolute silence. I let your father call me barren at family dinners. I let your mother treat me like a defective commodity. I took every single cruel insult on the chin to protect your masculine pride. And how exactly did you handle my 11 years of absolute loyalty?" Fiona asked, her voice dropping into a deadly whisper. "You threw a lavish, deeply public baby shower for a gold-digging mistress. I remember watching you stand in the center of that country club ballroom. You soaked up the applause of our peers. You looked at me across the room with pure, unadulterated contempt. You threw my devotion into the dirt just to experience a fleeting moment of cruel, fabricated glory." Derek choked on a sob, dropping heavily to his knees on the cold concrete. Pedestrians walked past, giving the weeping man in the retail uniform a wide, uncomfortable berth. "I was out of my mind," Fiona Derek bawled, clutching his hands tightly to his chest. "I was not thinking clearly." "You were thinking perfectly clearly the day you handed me the divorce papers," Fiona corrected, her tone completely merciless. "I remember the exact look on your face. You smirked. You stood in our kitchen, puffed out your chest, and boldly told me you were finally trading up for a real family. You felt like an absolute king because you believed you had finally beaten me. You enjoyed hurting me, Derek. You reveled in the cruelty." "I have absolutely nothing," Derek wept, burying his face in his hands. "I am completely ruined. I have no family, no home, no money, and no future. My parents will not even look at me. Please, Fiona, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Just show me a fraction of the grace you used to have. Help me." Fiona looked down at the shattered remains of her former husband. She did not feel anger or sadness. She felt nothing at all. She reached into her designer leather handbag and pulled out her slim wallet. She smoothly extracted a crisp $5 bill from the fold. She held it out and let it flutter down from her perfectly manicured fingers. The green bill landed softly on the damp pavement right next to Derek's scuffed wet sneaker. "Buy yourself a hot coffee, Derek," Fiona said, her voice echoing with absolute icy finality. "It is going to be a very long shift at the hardware store. And remember, your embezzlement restitution payment is due to my holding firm on the 1st of the month. Do not be late." She turned on her heel and walked elegantly toward her waiting black town car, leaving him weeping uncontrollably on the bustling city sidewalk. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed like a vault ceiling. Inside the expansive mahogany-paneled room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Derek sat rigidly at the defendant table, wearing a faded, poorly fitting suit he had salvaged from the back of his closet. His posture was completely defeated, his shoulders slumped forward, and his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood grain of the table. He looked nothing like the arrogant tech executive who had once strutted through five-star restaurants and country club lobbies. He looked like a hollow shell of a man entirely broken by his own spectacular hubris. Behind him in the gallery sat Richard and Linda. The contrast between their current state and their former glory was staggering. Richard's face was drawn and pale, his once booming patriarchal chest now sunken beneath a wrinkled dress shirt. Linda clutched a crumpled tissue tightly in her trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing courtroom. They had spent decades carefully cultivating an image of elite, untouchable wealth. They had thrown lavish parties, dictated social hierarchies, and looked down their noses at anyone they deemed inferior. Now they were sitting in a public gallery, terrified and waiting for a judge to determine the exact severity of their total financial ruin. The side doors opened and Fiona walked into the courtroom accompanied by a team of 3 elite corporate litigators. She did not look at Derek. She did not glance at Richard or Linda. She walked with the terrifying calm of a woman who had already won the war. She wore a tailored black wool suit with sharp, precise lines that radiated absolute authority. She took her seat at the plaintiff table, opening a slim leather folder with measured, quiet grace. There was no gloating in her expression. There was only the clinical detachment of an executive preparing to finalize a long overdue liquidation. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, a formidable man with sharp features and a reputation for absolute zero tolerance regarding corporate fraud. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone took their seats. The proceedings began with a swift, brutal efficiency that left Derek gasping for air. Fiona's lead attorney stood and immediately presented an airtight, meticulously documented case that intertwined the dissolution of the marriage with the catastrophic corporate embezzlement. "Your Honor," the attorney stated, projecting his voice clearly across the quiet room, "we are here today to finalize the absolute distribution of marital assets and to address the massive financial restitution required regarding the defendant's deliberate theft of corporate funds. We have submitted comprehensive financial audits, bank transfers, and signed affidavits detailing how Derek Sterling systematically siphoned $400,000 from accounts technically owned by his wife's umbrella corporation. He utilized these stolen funds to finance a secret luxury lifestyle for an unrelated third party." Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and flipped through the thick binders of evidence resting on his elevated bench. He spent several long, agonizing minutes reading the highlighted sections of the financial forensics report. The silence in the courtroom grew so thick it felt physically oppressive. Derek stared at his hands, his breathing shallow and rapid. Richard wiped cold sweat from his brow while Linda squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch the judge absorb the full extent of her son's profound deceit. Furthermore, the attorney continued, turning his attention toward the gallery where Richard and Linda sat, shrinking into the wooden benches. "We must address the foundational loans that launched the defendant's tech firm 5 years ago. Richard and Linda Sterling secretly co-signed these massive commercial loans, utilizing their own construction firm as primary collateral. However, forensic accounting has revealed a pattern of fraudulent loan maneuvering. They intentionally obfuscated their debt-to-income ratio to secure these funds, tying their personal and commercial assets directly to Derek Sterling's fraudulent corporate entity." Judge Harrison looked up from the documents, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He removed his glasses and pinned Derek with a stare so intensely furious that Derek visibly flinched. "Mr. Sterling." The judge began, his voice vibrating with poorly concealed rage. "I have presided over this court for 22 years. I have seen every variety of corporate greed, theft, and marital deceit. But your actions rank among the most repulsive and pathetically arrogant displays of entitlement I have ever been forced to review." Derek opened his mouth to offer a pathetic apology, but Judge Harrison immediately raised his hand, silencing him with absolute authority. "You do not speak in my courtroom, Mr. Sterling," the judge snapped. "You sit there and you listen. The financial records submitted to this court paint a very clear, very undeniable picture. 3 years ago, your tech firm was bleeding capital. You were weeks away from total bankruptcy. You were failing. And who stepped in to save you? Who injected millions of dollars in silent capital to keep your doors open and your employees paid? It was your wife. Fiona Sterling utilized the immense profits from her own fiercely successful accounting and holding firm to secretly prop up your failing business. She extended the same financial grace to your father's struggling commercial construction company, quietly underwriting the massive line of credit that saved him from total ruin." Judge Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy oak bench. "She saved your entire family from the brink of financial disaster. She kept your arrogant facade intact. She absorbed your family's relentless toxic judgment, all while serving as the invisible pillar holding up your entire world. And how did you repay this extraordinary loyalty and financial grace? You publicly humiliated her. You paraded a mistress in front of your social circle, and you stole $400,000 of Fiona's own money to buy designer luggage and penthouse suites for a woman who viewed you as nothing more than an easy mark. You are a profound disgrace, Mr. Sterling. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. The air in the room grew completely still. Regarding the dissolution of this marriage, Judge Harrison announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. I am ordering a total and complete asset forfeiture in favor of the plaintiff. Fiona Sterling will retain 100% ownership of the holding company, all associated corporate entities, all physical properties, and all intellectual patents. You are entitled to zero alimony. You are entitled to zero spousal support. You walk out of this courtroom with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on your back. Derek let out a low, agonizing groan, burying his face in his trembling hands. Regarding the corporate embezzlement, Judge Harrison continued, his tone devoid of any mercy. The federal prosecutor has agreed to a highly specific plea arrangement. You will avoid serving time in a federal penitentiary today. However, you should not view this as a victory. The court has determined that sitting in a cell, receiving taxpayer-funded meals is entirely too lenient for your specific brand of fraud. Instead, you will spend the rest of your natural life making the plaintiff whole. I am ordering a strict maximum wage garnishment. 65% of your gross income from your current retail employment and any future employment will be automatically seized and transferred to Fiona Sterling's holding company until the $400,000 plus extensive legal fees and punitive damages are paid in full. You will live on pennies for decades. The sharp crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block echoed like a gunshot. Derek collapsed forward onto the table, entirely ruined, doomed to a lifetime of minimum wage servitude. But Judge Harrison was not finished. He turned his piercing gaze toward the gallery, locking eyes directly with Richard and Linda. The older couple froze, their breath catching in their throats as the full weight of the judicial system fell upon them. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the judge stated coldly, you knowingly co-signed foundational loans for a fraudster. You utilized your commercial construction business as collateral, and you engaged in highly questionable financial maneuvering to secure that initial capital. Because your son has defaulted and embezzled corporate assets, the collateral clause on your massive debt has been legally and permanently triggered. Linda let out a high-pitched, terrified gasp, clutching her husband's arm. Richard stared at the judge, his face completely devoid of color. Your commercial construction firm has already been seized and liquidated, Judge Harrison declared, delivering the absolute final blow. However, that liquidation did not cover the massive deficit you accumulated. Therefore, to satisfy the remaining balance owed to Fiona Sterling's holding company, the court hereby orders the immediate forced sale of your primary residence. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the property is seized and sold at public auction. The ultimate symbol of their elite social status, their sprawling, immaculately decorated mansion, was completely gone. Richard and Linda were left sitting in the quiet courtroom, stripped of their wealth, their business, their home, and their dignity, forced to realize that their golden child had cost them absolutely everything. The 30-day eviction grace period granted by Judge Harrison evaporated with terrifying speed. Now the sprawling, manicured lawn of the Sterling estate served as the brightly lit stage for their absolute public humiliation. Richard stood at the rear bumper of a rented economy moving van, struggling to lift a taped cardboard box filled with old tax documents. His hands shook violently and his breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The long paved driveway was littered with black plastic trash bags and haphazardly packed plastic storage bins. The bank liquidators had already swept through the property days prior, stripping the interior of anything remotely valuable. The imported Persian rugs, the crystal chandeliers, the antique mahogany furniture, and the expansive curated art collection had all been seized and catalogued to satisfy the massive commercial deficit. Richard and Linda were legally permitted to take only their personal clothing and worthless sentimental items. Linda emerged from the grand front doors carrying an armful of tangled wire hangers draped with winter coats. Her face was gaunt, hollow, and completely drained of its former arrogant vitality. She kept darting panicked, mortified glances toward the property line. The Sterling mansion sat in the center of an exclusive gated community where wealth was usually quiet, but judgment was currently deafening. Today the neighbors were not quiet. Across the perfectly paved street, a cluster of women in pristine white tennis skirts stood openly pointing and whispering behind their hands. A man Richard had played golf with every Sunday for 2 decades slowly drove past in a silver sports car, not even bothering to offer a polite wave. They were absolute social pariahs. Their spectacular financial ruin and their son's federal embezzlement conviction had been the premier gossip at the country club for a month, and watching the former king and queen of the neighborhood load their pathetic remaining possessions into a budget truck was the grand finale. A gleaming black luxury SUV turned sharply onto the long circular driveway, its heavy tires crunching aggressively over the crushed gravel. The vehicle pulled to a smooth, calculated stop directly behind the rented moving van, effectively blocking it in. Richard dropped his cardboard box. It hit the pavement with a dull thud, bursting open at a corner and spilling manila folders onto the concrete. Linda froze on the front steps, dropping her hangers entirely. The rear door of the luxury SUV opened and Fiona stepped out. She looked immaculate, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer over a crisp white silk blouse and sharply creased trousers. Her posture radiated the kind of effortless, untouchable authority Richard had always believed exclusively belonged to him. She was flanked immediately by 2 members of her elite legal team, the exact same sharp-suited attorneys who had delivered the initial foreclosure notices in her corporate office. Fiona did not look angry. She did not look vindictive. She surveyed the chaotic, messy driveway and the sweating, broken older couple with the detached, analytical gaze of a property developer assessing a newly acquired asset. She adjusted her designer sunglasses against the harsh afternoon glare and walked slowly toward the front entrance, stopping a few feet away from where Richard stood, trembling by the moving van. Richard felt his face flush with a toxic, burning mixture of deep shame and resurrected patriarchal rage. He wiped his dirty hands aggressively on his stained trousers and stepped forward, puffing out his sunken chest in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim his territory. "Are you here to gloat, Fiona?" Richard snarled, his voice hoarse from physical exhaustion and lingering fury. "Is this what you wanted? You took our company. You took my son's future. Now you show up on the very day we are being thrown into the street like common criminals just to watch us suffer. Have you no basic human decency? Have you no shame at all?" Linda hurried down the front steps, standing slightly behind her husband's shoulder. "You are a monster, Fiona." Linda hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer venom. "We gave you everything. We welcomed you into our elite social circle. We treated you like a daughter for 11 years, and you systematically destroyed us over a simple misunderstanding. You want to see us cry. You want to see us broken and homeless. Well, take a good look and leave our property immediately." Fiona slowly removed her sunglasses, slipping them neatly into the breast pocket of her blazer. She looked at Richard and then at Linda, her expression entirely devoid of pity, anger, or amusement. "I am not here to gloat, Richard," Fiona stated, her voice carrying clearly and sharply across the quiet suburban lawn. "I have absolutely no interest in watching you pack your garbage bags into a rental van. I am a highly busy executive with a massive holding company to run. I am here performing a routine asset inspection." Richard frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Asset inspection," he repeated. "The bank took this property. The court ordered it sold at public commercial auction to cover the debt your company activated. It does not belong to you anymore. You have no legal right to be standing on this driveway." "That is where you are factually incorrect," Fiona corrected smoothly, her tone perfectly level. "The property was indeed listed at public commercial auction last Tuesday to satisfy the outstanding corporate lien you generated by co-signing for a fraudster. And my holding firm placed the winning bid. I outbid every single real estate developer in the state entirely in cash. I hold the permanent deed. I am the sole legal owner of this estate, and I am here to conduct the final property walkthrough before the new occupants arrive." The color completely drained from Richard's face. His knees buckled slightly and he had to lean heavily against the side of the dirty moving van to keep his balance. Linda let out a strangled, horrific gasp, covering her mouth with both trembling hands. They had believed the bank would sell the mansion to another wealthy family. They had desperately told themselves that at least the prestigious Sterling estate would remain an elite residential property, maintaining the high-class legacy they had carefully curated for decades. Knowing that Fiona personally owned their sanctuary was a psychological death blow. "You bought our home?" Linda whispered, her voice hollow and shaking. "What are you going to do with it? Are you going to move in here? Are you going to sleep in my master bedroom and host your corporate cocktail parties in my formal dining room just to mock our memory every single day?" Fiona shook her head, a faint clinical smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I have zero interest in living in a massive, tasteless monument to your profound arrogance," Fiona replied calmly. "I have secured much better, significantly more productive plans for this specific acreage." A modest silver sedan pulled into the driveway, parking neatly on the curb behind Fiona's SUV. A woman in a practical beige pantsuit stepped out, carrying a thick clipboard and a bright canvas tote bag. Fiona gestured toward the woman, inviting her to join them near the front steps. "Richard and Linda, I would like to introduce you to Sarah Jenkins," Fiona announced, her voice projecting clearly. Sarah is the Regional Executive Director of the Horizon Women's Coalition. They are a highly respected local charity that specializes in providing emergency transitional housing and comprehensive vocational support for single mothers facing sudden extreme financial destitution. Richard stared at the woman in the beige suit, completely failing to comprehend the introduction. "Why is a charity director standing in my driveway?" Richard demanded, his voice rising in sudden frantic panic. "Because I have officially transferred the deed of this property to her organization," Fiona stated, her tone ringing with absolute final authority. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a heavy set of brass keys, and handed them directly to the director. "I am donating this entire estate to the Horizon Women's Coalition. Next week, they will begin converting your grand ballroom, your formal dining room, and your 6 luxury bedrooms into a multi-family transitional shelter. This mansion will serve as a safe haven for dozens of vulnerable single mothers and their young children to rebuild their lives free of charge." Linda let out a piercing, horrified shriek as the brutal reality set in. "No!" she screamed, lunging forward before Fiona's lawyers stepped swiftly, blocking her path. "You cannot do that. The Homeowners Association will block you immediately. This is an elite gated neighborhood. You cannot turn the Sterling estate into a homeless shelter. It will completely destroy our legacy. Our friends live here. Your legacy was destroyed the moment you co-signed a fraudulent loan to enable your embezzling, entitled son," Fiona replied, her voice cold and completely unyielding. "The Homeowners Association has already approved the zoning variance due to the massive commercial endowment my holding firm attached to the charitable donation. Your country club friends watching from across the street right now are fully aware of exactly what this property is becoming. Your elite social status is entirely eradicated, Linda. Every time your wealthy neighbors drive past this massive shelter, they will not remember your lavish garden parties. They will only remember the spectacular, undeniable financial collapse of the Sterling family." Fiona turned her back on them, looking toward the charity director. "The building is yours, Sarah." Fiona glanced over her shoulder one last time. "Finish packing your trash bags, Richard. You have exactly 1 hour before my security team locks the gates permanently." Fiona turned and walked back to her SUV, accompanied by her legal team, leaving Richard and Linda weeping on the concrete, forever exiled from the kingdom they had built on lies. 6 months later, the relentless buzzing of the fluorescent warehouse lights served as the daily soundtrack to Derek's personal hell. He stood in aisle 14 of a massive discount hardware store, wearing a stiff neon orange vest over a stained polo shirt. His hands, once soft and manicured from years of typing on executive keyboards, were now rough, blistered, and covered in thick calluses. He hoisted a 50-pound bag of industrial soil onto his right shoulder. His lower back screamed in agonizing protest. He gritted his teeth and carried the heavy plastic sack toward a waiting flatbed cart. A customer snapped their fingers at him. Hey, buddy, I need 3 more of these loaded into my truck. Derek forced his eyes to the floor. Right away, sir, he mumbled, his voice completely devoid of the booming arrogance that had once defined his entire existence. He loaded the bags, his muscles trembling under the extreme physical strain. This was his reality for 12 grueling hours every single day. When his shift finally ended, Derek trudged into the dreary employee break room to collect his bi-weekly pay stub. He tore open the thin paper envelope with stiff fingers. He stared at the printed numbers, and a hollow, suffocating despair washed over him. His gross pay was meager, but his net pay was practically non-existent. The federal court order was absolute and completely merciless. 65% of his wages were automatically seized and transferred directly to Fiona's holding company to satisfy the massive embezzlement restitution. Derek folded the pathetic check and shoved it into his pocket. He walked out into the freezing rain, shivering violently in his cheap windbreaker. He faced a 2-mile walk to the squalid, pest-infested motel where he now lived. He had no car, no savings, and no friends. The elite social circle he had once dominated had completely erased him from their collective memory. He spent his nights staring at a stained ceiling, listening to the roar of the interstate highway, completely isolated and entirely broken. He was paying for his betrayal penny by agonizing penny. Across the city, a distinctly different kind of nightmare held Brittany captive. The deafening stereo wails of 2 colicky infants bounced violently off the thin, uninsulated walls of a cramped second-floor apartment. Brittany sat slumped on a sagging floral sofa, wearing stained sweatpants and a faded t-shirt covered in baby formula. Her hair was matted into a messy knot at the base of her neck. She looked completely exhausted, entirely drained of the manufactured glamorous glow she had once projected to the world. She had been forced to move back in with her own parents. The small apartment smelled strongly of stale cooking oil and sour milk. In the narrow galley kitchen, her mother and father were currently engaged in a vicious screaming match over a stack of past-due utility bills. They had entirely drained their own meager retirement savings, trying to sustain Brittany's lavish lifestyle before the absolute truth of her fraud was exposed. Now they were all drowning in a sea of insurmountable debt. "You were supposed to secure a millionaire," her mother shrieked, slamming a fist down on the cheap laminate countertop. "You promised us a mansion, Brittany. You promised us early retirement. Instead, you brought a massive federal scandal to our doorstep and 2 screaming babies we cannot even afford to feed." Brittany squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands hard over her ears to block out the noise. She reached for her cracked smartphone resting on the coffee table. She opened a generic social media application using an anonymous burner account. She typed her own name into the search bar, hoping the digital mob had finally moved on. They had not moved on. The top search results were endless compilations of her spectacular downfall. Former fans had created highly detailed video essays breaking down her extortion attempts, her fake pregnancy timeline, and the brutal legal receipts Fiona had released. The internet remembered everything. She was permanently branded as a toxic, manipulative grifter. The club promoter who fathered the twins had completely vanished, changing his number and moving out of state to avoid any financial responsibility. Derek was a bankrupt retail worker. Brittany was permanently trapped in this claustrophobic squalor, surrounded by screaming children and bitter, resentful parents. Her golden ticket had turned into a life sentence of absolute chaos. High above the grime and noise of the city's streets, the atmosphere was crisp, clean, and perfectly serene. Fiona stood on the expansive wraparound glass terrace of her newly purchased luxury penthouse. The city skyline sparkled beneath her feet like a vast carpet of crushed diamonds stretching out toward the dark horizon. The night air was cool, but she felt entirely warm, protected by the undeniable fortress of success she had built with her own 2 hands. She wore a stunning tailored emerald green silk evening gown that draped flawlessly over her frame. Her dark hair was pinned back in a loose, elegant style. She looked radiant, rested, and completely unburdened by the heavy, toxic weight she had carried for 11 years. The stress and anxiety that had once defined her marriage were entirely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. Inside the massive penthouse, the atmosphere was vibrant and alive. The open concept living space featured soaring 20-foot ceilings, rich mahogany floors, and a striking modern chandelier that cast a warm golden glow over a long formal dining table. A private chef moved quietly in the background, putting the final exquisite touches on a 5-course gourmet meal in the pristine marble kitchen. Fiona turned away from the breathtaking skyline and slid the heavy glass terrace door shut, stepping back into the warmth of her home. The dining table was not filled with sycophants, corporate climbers, or toxic enablers. It was not filled with people who judged her worth by her ability to produce children or conform to archaic patriarchal standards. The table was filled entirely with her chosen family. At the direct center of the table sat Sylvia Derrick's mother. Sylvia wore a beautiful tailored silver blouse, her posture relaxed and her eyes bright with genuine joy. When the absolute undeniable truth of Derrick's abhorrent behavior and Richard's fraudulent business maneuvering had been exposed, Sylvia had made a monumental choice. She had refused to participate in the delusional, toxic enabling that defined her husband and son. She had completely severed ties with her own blood, recognizing that integrity and basic human decency mattered more than blind familial loyalty. Sylvia had stood firmly by Fiona's side, providing crucial emotional support while Fiona dismantled the empire of lies Derrick had built. Now Sylvia was a permanent, honored fixture in Fiona's new life. Seated next to Sylvia was Marcus, Fiona's brilliant public relations director. He was currently leaning back in his velvet dining chair, laughing loudly at a sharp, witty remark made by Sarah, the lead corporate attorney who had successfully executed the absolute destruction of the Sterling family assets. They were the brilliant architects of Fiona's legal and public victory. They had fought tirelessly to ensure her holding company remained entirely untouched by the scandal. Surrounding them were a tight-knit circle of fiercely loyal friends, colleagues, and allies who had proven their worth through absolute unwavering support. Fiona walked gracefully toward the head of the table. As she took her seat, the lively conversation naturally softened, settling into a comfortable, warm silence. She looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with every single person seated before her. She did not have to shrink herself to make a fragile, insecure man feel powerful. She did not have to hide her immense wealth, her sharp intelligence, or her commanding authority. She was the undisputed master of her own reality. She reached out and picked up a tall crystal flute filled with vintage sparkling champagne. The elegant glass caught the light, throwing tiny prismatic reflections across the dark mahogany table. Fiona looked at Sylvia, who offered a soft, encouraging nod. There was absolutely no need for a dramatic, sweeping speech. The days of defending herself against cruel, petty accusations were permanently over. The cold, calculating anger that had fueled her surgical revenge had entirely evaporated. It had served its precise purpose and was no longer required. What remained was a clean, bright, empty canvas. "To clean breaks," Fiona said softly, her voice carrying a quiet, absolute strength that resonated throughout the beautiful dining room. "And to building our empires entirely on our own terms." The table erupted into a chorus of warm agreement. Glasses clinked musically against one another. Sylvia raised her glass high, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her face. Marcus and Sarah echoed the toast, their expressions filled with deep professional and personal respect. Fiona took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp, chilled champagne. She felt the cool liquid slide down her throat, perfectly mirroring the crisp clarity of her new existence. She set the glass down and let a genuine, unbothered smile spread across her face. She had successfully orchestrated the total annihilation of the people who had tried to destroy her, and she had executed that destruction without compromising a single ounce of her dignity. Down below, hidden in the dark, miserable shadows of the sprawling city, Derrick was sweeping concrete floors for minimum wage. Brittany was drowning in the chaotic consequences of her own desperate greed. Richard and Linda were wandering the streets entirely stripped of their arrogant illusions. The toxic elements of Fiona's past were currently burning to ash in the very fires they had recklessly lit themselves. Up here in the radiant golden light of the penthouse, Fiona was completely untouchable. She was wealthy, she was surrounded by genuine love, and she was finally blissfully free.